Hey guys, tonight we journey into the twilight of the gods with a Norse villager who witnesses the end of everything he's ever known. This is the story of Ragnarok, not from the perspective of mighty Thor or wise Odin, but through the eyes of an ordinary man watching cosmic forces tear reality apart piece by piece. From the first ominous signs in a peaceful mountain valley to the final destruction and rebirth of the universe itself, you'll experience why no mortal could survive the Fimbulwinter, the breaking of ancient bonds, and the ultimate battle between order and chaos. This is mythology designed for sleep, slow, immersive, and deliberately boring in the most soothing way possible. So before you settle in for this 2-hour journey to the end of worlds, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into ancient stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what mythological tale you'd like to see get the boring for sleep treatment next. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin with a cold morning in a Norse valley where the first signs of cosmic ending are just beginning to stir. You wake up in your small wooden longhouse to the sound of wind howling through the gaps in the timber walls, but something feels different this morning. The cold seems to bite deeper than usual, seeping through the thick woolen blankets your wife wove last summer when the world still made sense. As you slowly open your eyes, you notice the frost has formed intricate patterns on the inside of your home, delicate, crystalline fingers reaching across the wooden beams, like the artwork of some unseen spirit. The fire in the central hearth has died down to barely glowing embers, and you can see your breath forming small clouds in the dim morning light, filtering through the smoke hole above. This shouldn't be happening in what should be the middle of spring. You've lived in this valley for 32 winters now, and you know the rhythms of the seasons like you know the beating of your own heart. Something is wrong. You pull yourself from the warmth of your sleeping furs and pad across the cold earthen floor to rekindle the fire, though it feels colder than usual beneath your fingers, almost reluctant to catch flame. As you blow gently on the embers, coaxing them back to life, you remember your grandfather's stories about the old times when the gods walked more freely among men and the very air itself could carry omens for those wise enough to read them. Outside, you hear the lowing of your cattle, but it's not their usual contented sound. There's an edge to it, a note of distress that makes something twist uncomfortably in your stomach. You've been raising livestock since you were barely tall enough to reach a cow's udder, and you know when animals are simply cold, when they're afraid. The fire finally catches, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls where your weapons hang, your father's sword, your own spear, the small eating knife your son will inherit someday if there's a someday. You shake that thought away. Where did it come from? Why are you thinking about endings on what should be an ordinary morning? You step outside into the gray pre-dawn light and immediately notice that the birds are wrong, not up and trom. The ravens that usually call raucously from the tall pine trees are silent, perched like black judges watching something you cannot see. Their dark eyes seem to follow your movement with an intelligence that makes your skin crawl. Ravens are Odin's birds, you remember. They see things that mortals cannot. The air itself tastes different. Usually, the morning air in your valley carries the scent of pine needles, fresh water from the stream, and the earthy smell of growing things. But today, there's something else underneath it all, something metallic and sharp, like the taste of blood or the smell that comes before a terrible storm. You've lived through enough harsh weather to know when the sky is preparing something violent. But this feels deeper, older, more fundamental than any ordinary tempest. Your neighbor Bjorn emerges from his own dwelling, and you catch his eye across the small cluster of buildings that makes up your settlement. He looks as unsettled as you feel, his usually cheerful face drawn and serious. You raise your hand in greeting, but his response is distracted, his gaze constantly shifting to the sky and the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The animals wouldn't settle last night. He calls to you, his voice, carrying strangely in the still air, kept pacing and snorting like there were wolves about. But I checked the perimeter twice. Nothing there. You nod, understanding completely. Your own livestock had been restless, shifting and stamping in their enclosure until well past midnight. But like Bjorn, you had found no signs of predators, no tracks in the snow, no scent of wolf or bear, just that underlying wrongness that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath your feet. As you tend to your morning tasks, feeding the animals, checking the water supply, inspecting the fence posts for winter damage, you begin to notice other small signs that don't quite fit the natural order of things. The stream that runs through your valley is flowing faster than usual, Its water is darker and more turbulent despite the lack of recent rain or snowmelt. The pine trees that have stood sentinel over your home for generations seem to be swaying, without any wind to move them, their branches creaking with sounds almost like whispered conversations. Your wife Astrid joins you in the yard, wrapping her woolen cloak tightly around her shoulders. She's always been more sensitive to the subtle changes in the world around you, more attuned to the messages that nature sends to those who know how to listen. Her grandmother was said to have some small measure of the sight, the ability to sense things beyond the ordinary world. And sometimes you wonder if that gift has passed down through the generations. The children had nightmares again, she tells you quietly, her breath forming small clouds as she speaks, all of them. The same dream about wolves the size of horses and a great tree burning. You feel that uncomfortable twist in your stomach. Again, children's dreams are often just the random fears and fantasies of young minds. But when all the children in a settlement share the same terrifying visions, that's when the old stories begin to feel less like entertainment and more like warnings. Throughout the morning, as you work alongside your neighbors to repair winter damage and prepare for the planting season, that should be starting soon, you notice more irregularities. The sun, when it finally rises above the mountains, seems dimmer than it should be. Its light pale and watery as if filtered through some invisible veil. The shadows it casts are somehow wrong to sharp, to dark, stretching in directions that don't quite match the angle of the light. Old Gunnar, the eldest member of your community and the one who remembers the most stories from the ancient times, joins your small group as you work. He moves slowly, his joints stiff with age and old injuries, but his eyes are still sharp and knowing. He's been watching the sky all morning with an expression you've never seen on his weathered face. Before not fear exactly, but a deep, resigned understanding of something the rest of you haven't grasped yet. My grandmother told me. Once, he says suddenly, his voice cutting through the unusual quiet, that there would be signs before the end times. Not dramatic signs that would make men cry out in terror, but small things, subtle changes that would creep into the world like ice forming on a still pond, things that would make the wise uneasy and the animals restless. You pause in your work, a half-repaired fence post still in your hands, and look at the old man with growing unease. He's not usually one for dramatic pronouncements or apocalyptic warnings. Gunnar is practical, grounded, the kind of man who fixes problems with his hands and measures the world in terms of seasons and harvests. And the simple rhythms of daily life, she said the wolves would grow bold. He continues, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. The winters would stretch longer, brothers would begin to eye each other with suspicion, and the very earth would start to feel tired, as if summoned by his words. A wolf's howl echoes across the valley, not from the deep forest where such sounds belong, but from somewhere much closer. It's answered by another, and then another, until the air fills with a chorus of wild voices that seems to come from all directions at once. But these aren't the usual territorial calls or hunting signals you've heard countless times before. These howls have a quality that raises the hair on the back of your neck, a note of something that might be triumph or hunger or anticipation. The work stops. Everyone in your small group stands perfectly still, listening to those wild voices painting promises of violence across the morning air. When the howling finally fades, the silence that follows feels heavier than the sound itself. And in that silence, as you stand there with your neighbors and friends, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the life you've built in this valley, you begin to understand that the world you've known, the world of predictable seasons and comprehends travel dangers is slowly, quietly, but inexorably coming to an end. When the seers begin to whisper 3 days after the morning of strange howls, you find yourself walking the familiar path to the larger settlement at the mouth of your valley, where the weekly market brings together people from the scattered farms and homesteads throughout the region. Usually, this is a journey you look forward to, a chance to trade your goods, hear news from distant places, and catch up with friends and relatives you might not see for weeks at a time. But today, even the 2-hour walk feels different, charged with an undercurrent of unease that seems to rise from the very ground beneath your feet. The path winds through stands of ancient pine and birch, trees that have watched over this route for generations beyond counting. You've walked this way hundreds of times, in every season and every kind of weather. But today you notice things that have never caught your attention before. The bark on many of the older trees bears strange marks, not the clean cuts of woodsmen's tools or the claw marks of bears, but something else entirely. Long, parallel scratches that look almost like runic symbols, though you can't read their meaning. They seem fresh, the inner was still pale and raw, as if something had passed this way very recently with claws or talons capable of scoring deep. Gouged the living timber, the birds are still wrong. Yesterday, you might have dismissed it as seasonal behavior or the natural response to an unusual weather pattern, but now you're beginning to recognize a pattern in their wrongness. They perch in groups larger than normal, their small heads all turned in the same direction, toward the north, and the high mountains where the old stories say the gods themselves once walked among the peaks. When you stop to rest beside a small stream that crosses the path, you notice that even the water sounds different, not the cheerful babbling you've always associated with this particular brook, but something more urgent, almost like whispered conversations in a language you don't quite understand. As you approach the settlement, you can see the market already bustling with activity, but there's something subdued about the usual chaos of trading and socializing. Voices are lower than normal, and people seem to cluster in smaller, more intimate groups rather than the large, boisterous gatherings that typically characterize market days. You recognize many of the faces from previous weeks, but their expressions are more guarded, more watchful than you remember. You set up your own small trading area with the goods you've brought, some fine woolen cloth that Astrid wove during the long winter evenings, a few pieces of carved bonework, and some of the smoked fish that your settlement is known for throughout the region. But even as you arrange your wares and greet familiar customers, you can't shake the feeling that everyone is waiting for something, though no one seems quite sure what that something might be. It's then that you notice her. Ragnhild the Velva sits in her usual place near the center of the market, but today there's a crowd gathered around her unlike anything you've seen before. Usually, people approach the seeress with specific questions, concerns about health, requests for advice about marriages or business ventures, the kinds of practical matters that make up the substance of daily life. But today, the crowd around her is different, larger, more intense, filled with faces that show not curiosity but something approaching desperation. Velvas have always been part of your world, respected figures who serve as intermediaries between the human realm and the mysteries that lie beyond ordinary understanding. Ragnhild has held this role in your region for nearly 20 years, ever since the old seeress who preceded her passed into the shadow realm. You've consulted her yourself on a few occasions when Astrid was struggling to conceive your first child, when deciding whether to expand your livestock holdings, when your younger brother was considering a dangerous trading voyage to the eastern lands. But you've never seen her like this. She sits perfectly still in the center of the gathered crowd, her usually bright eyes staring at something no one else can see. Her hands rest motionless in her lap, and her breathing is so shallow you have to watch carefully to see the rise and fall of her chest. The wooden staff that marks her office as a Velva lies across her knees, its carved symbol seeming to shift and dance in the uncertain light. When she finally speaks, her voice carries clearly across the market despite its soft, almost conversational tone. It's not the theatrical pronouncement you might expect from someone delivering prophecy, but something far more unsettling, the calm, matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting events they have witnessed personally. The wolf grows restless in his binding, she says, her gaze still fixed on that invisible something beyond the crowd. I have seen his yellow eyes opening in the darkness and felt the earth tremble with his rage. The gods fashioned chains to hold him, but even divine metalwork cannot contain what was never meant to be contained forever. A murmur runs through the gathered people, but it's not the skeptical muttering you might expect. Instead, it's the sound of recognition, as if her words are confirming fears that have been growing in the back of everyone's mind. Without quite reaching the level of conscious thought, you find yourself drawn closer to the circle, abandoning your trading goods, and pushing gently through the crowd until you can see her face clearly. Ragnhild's features are slack, almost vacant, but her eyes burn with an intensity that makes you want to look away. This is the face of someone who has seen beyond the boundaries of the normal world, and returned with knowledge that no mortal mind was meant to carry. The serpent stirs in the deep waters, she continues, her voice maintaining that same eerily conversational tone. I have felt the ocean floor crack beneath his coils, and heard the whales singing songs of ending. The world ocean grows dark with his poison, and soon the waves will carry death to every shore. An old fisherman near the front of the crowd makes a sound that might be a sob or might be a prayer. You recognize him, Thorvald, who has spent his entire life reading the moods of the sea and the behavior of the creatures that live beneath its surface. If anyone would understand the significance of the Velva's words about the ocean, it would be him. At Loki, here, Ragnhild's voice drops to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carries to every ear in the crowd. Loki writhes in his torment, and the very stones that pin him weep with the acid of his rage. I have seen the mountains crack, and felt the earth itself crying out in pain. The bound god's suffering has become too great for even the foundations of the world to bear. The crowd is completely silent now, even the normal sounds of the market fading to nothing as her words settle over everyone like a heavy blanket. You realize that you're holding your breath, and when you finally exhale, the sound seems unnaturally loud in the stillness. But it's what happens next that will stay with you long after this day has passed into memory. Ragnhild's eyes suddenly focus, snapping from their distant stare to look directly at you with an intensity that feels like a physical blow. For a moment that stretches far longer than any moment should, you feel as if she's looking not just at you, but through you, reading the content of your soul like runes carved in stone. You, she says, and her voice is no longer the detached tone of prophecy, but something personal and immediate. You who tend the land in the shadow of the great mountains, you have felt it too, haven't you? The wrongness in the soil, the restlessness in the creatures under your care. Your dreams have been dark lately, filled with visions of fire and flood and the sound of breaking bonds. You want to deny it, to laugh off her words, as the theatrical nonsense of someone playing on people's natural fears and superstitions. But you can't, because she's right. Your dreams have been dark, filled with images that make no rational sense but feel more real than waking life. Visions of great chains snapping like spider webs, of mountains splitting open to reveal fires that burn without fuel, of the sun itself flickering like a candle in a storm. The signs are all around us. Ragnhild continues, her gaze still fixed on you with that unnerving intensity. The wise have always known that this time would come. The cycle turns, as it must, and what was bound will be unbound. What was built will fall. What lives will die, so that what comes after may be born. She rises slowly from her seated position, her movements careful and deliberate as if she's carrying some tremendous weight. The carved staff in her hand seems to pulse with its own inner light, though that might just be a trick of the uncertain afternoon sun. The Fimbulwinter comes, she says, her voice now carrying clearly across the entire market. 3 winters, with no summer between, and in that darkness, the bonds that hold the world together will strain and crack and finally break. Those who would survive what follows must prepare not their bodies, but their souls, for in the end, courage will matter, more than strength, and wisdom more than weapons. With that, she turns away from the crowd and begins walking toward the edge of the settlement, her staff clicking against the hard-packed earth with each step. The gathered people watch her go in complete silence, and it's only after she disappears from view that the normal sounds of the market slowly begin to resume. But they're muted now, subdued, as if everyone present understands that something fundamental has changed. The conversations that do start up are conducted in low, urgent whispers, and you notice that people keep glancing toward the northern mountains where Ragnhild's gaze had been fixed during her pronouncement. You try to return to your trading, to focus on the ordinary business of exchanging goods and catching up with neighbors. But her words echo in your mind with the persistence of a half-remembered song. The Fimbulwinter, the wolf growing restless, the serpents stirring in the deep waters. These aren't abstract concepts from ancient stories anymore. They're immediate realities pressing in on your world like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. As the afternoon wears on and the market slowly winds down, you find yourself in quiet conversations with people you've known for years, people whose judgment and practical wisdom you've always respected. And in those conversations, a pattern emerges that chills you more than Ragnhild's prophecies. Everyone has noticed the signs, the strange behavior of animals, the unusual weather patterns, the subtle wrongness that seems to permeate everything. Old Eric, whose family has farmed the same valley for 6 generations, tells you about crops that refuse to grow properly despite perfect soil conditions. Sigrid, the weaver whose family has supplied cloth to the region for decades, mentions that her sheep have been producing wool with an odd, metallic tinge that resists dying. Most disturbing of all, everyone reports the same kinds of dreams, visions of binding chains snapping, of great wolves running free across burning landscapes, of the very foundations of the world cracking like ice in spring, dreams that feel less like the random firing of sleeping minds and more like glimpses of some approaching reality. By the time you begin the journey home, the sun is already low in the western sky, and the shadows stretch long across the familiar landscape. But those shadows seem different now, darker and more substantial, as if they're not just the absence of light, but the presence of something else entirely. The walk back to your valley has never felt longer, and with each step, Ragnhild's words seem to gain weight and substance in your mind. The Fimbulwinter, the time of endings and new beginnings, the cycle turning as it must, carrying away everything you've known and loved in preparation for whatever comes after. And as you finally crest the hill that overlooks your home, you realize that the world you wake up to tomorrow will be fundamentally different from the one you knew yesterday, not because anything has changed, but because you now understand what those changes mean. Part 3. The Fimbulwinter begins. It has been 8 months since you last felt truly warm. You wake this morning as you have for the past several weeks, with frost coating the inside of your breath and ice crystals forming in your beard where moisture from your sleeping breath has frozen solid during the night. The heavy woolen blankets that once provided adequate protection against ordinary winter cold now feel thin as summer cloth, and no matter how high you build the fire in your central hearth, the cold seems to seep through the very walls of your home like water through poorly chinked logs. Outside, the wind never stops. It's not the fierce, howling gale of a normal winter storm that arrives with dramatic intensity and then passes on to trouble other regions. Instead, it's a constant, low moaning that seems to come from every direction at once, carrying with it a cold so profound that it feels less like weather and more like the breath of some vast, malevolent entity that has settled over your world and decided to stay. You rise slowly from your sleeping furs, your joints stiff not just from the cold, but from the constant tension of trying to conserve body heat. Every movement requires conscious effort now, every task takes longer than it should, and every breath reminds you of how much energy your body is burning just to keep functioning in these impossible conditions. The fire has died down to barely glowing coals again, despite your careful banking of the embers before sleep. You've become expert at coaxing life from the smallest spark, but even so, the wood supply that should have lasted through a normal winter and well into spring is dwindling at an alarming rate. Each log you feed to the flames feels precious, irreplaceable, and you find yourself calculating and recalculating how long your remaining fuel might last against the growing certainty that this winter will not end where winters are supposed to. And Astrid stirs beside you, pulling the furs more tightly around her shoulders. She's grown thinner over these long months, as you all have. The food stores that seemed adequate for a normal winter began running low months ago. And even with careful rationing, you're all eating less than your bodies need to maintain warmth and strength. Her face, visible in the dim firelight, shows the sharp angles of ongoing hunger. And when she opens her eyes, they hold a weariness that goes deeper than simple fatigue. Any sign of dawn? She asks quietly, though you both know that dawn and sunset have become increasingly meaningless concepts. The sun, when it appears at all above the perpetual cloud cover, remains pale and distant, providing no warmth and barely enough light to distinguish day from night. The world exists in a constant twilight that makes every hour feel like the approach of evening, every morning like the continuation of an endless, gray afternoon. You make your way to the small window opening and push aside the heavy skin covering that helps keep out the worst of the cold. Outside, the landscape that was once familiar and welcoming has been transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow covers everything to a depth that would have been remarkable in the worst winter of your lifetime, and beneath that snow, you know, the ground is frozen so hard that come spring, if spring ever comes, it will take weeks of thawing before anyone can hope to plant crops again. The trees that once provided shelter and beauty to your valley now stand like skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with ice and snow, many of them split and broken under the impossible weight. The stream that used to flow year-round, providing fresh water for your settlement, has been frozen solid for months. To get water now, you and your neighbors must hack through ice nearly to feet thick, and even then, the effort leaves you exhausted and sweating despite the cold, only to freeze again in clothing that never fully dries. You can see smoke rising from a few of your neighbors' chimneys, but not as many as there should be. 3 families in your small settlement have already made the desperate decision to abandon their homes and attempt the dangerous journey to larger communities, where they hope to find better shelter and more resources. You haven't heard from any of them since they left, trudging away through the snow with their most essential possessions loaded onto makeshift sleds, their children bundled so heavily against the cold that only their eyes were visible. The decision to stay or go haunts Your own household discussions every night. Astrid argues for attempting the journey while you still have enough strength to travel, pointing out that your children are growing weaker with each passing week, and that waiting much longer might mean losing the ability to make such a journey at all. But you remember the stories of travelers found frozen solid beside the road, overtaken by exhaustion or sudden storms, and you can't bring yourself to risk your family's lives on the uncertain hope that conditions might be better elsewhere. Your eldest son, Eric, emerges from the sleeping area where the children huddle together for warmth. At 16, he's old enough to understand the full gravity of your situation, and the knowledge sits heavily on his young shoulders. He moves carefully, conserving energy as you've all learned to do, but you can see the questions in his eyes that he's too respectful to voice. Questions about how much longer the food will last, about what will happen when the wood runs out, about whether his younger siblings will live to see another summer. The daily routine that once brought structure and purpose to your life has been reduced to the absolute essentials of survival: feeding and maintaining the fire, checking the remaining food stores and calculating portions, melting ice for water, caring for the few animals that have survived the unnatural cold, though even they grow thinner and weaker despite your best efforts to keep them alive. Your livestock, which once numbered a dozen cattle and twice as many sheep, has been reduced to 3 cows and a handful of hardy goats. The sheep, despite their thick wool, proved surprisingly vulnerable to the extreme cold, and you were forced to butcher many of them early in the winter when it became clear they wouldn't survive anyway. The preserved meat from those animals has helped sustain your family, but those supplies are running low now, and each day you must decide whether to slaughter another animal for immediate food, or hope it will survive long enough to provide milk or wool or breeding stock for whatever comes after this endless winter. The psychological toll of the Fimbulwinter has been as devastating as the physical hardships. The constant cold creates a kind of mental numbness that makes it difficult to think clearly or plan effectively. The perpetual gray light affects everyone's mood, creating a sense of hopelessness that settles over your household like a heavy blanket. Arguments break out over trivial matters: who sits closest to the fire, how the remaining food should be distributed, whether it's worth the effort to maintain tasks that once seemed important but now feel pointless. In the face of overwhelming need, your youngest daughter, Astrid, who once delighted in playing elaborate games with carved wooden dolls, now spends most of her time sitting quietly near the fire, conserving energy and staring at the flames with the serious expression of someone far older than her 8 years. The games and songs that once filled your home during the long winter evenings have given way to a subdued quiet broken only by necessary conversation and the constant background sounds of wind and shifting wood and the occasional crack of ice settling. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the way the Fimbulwinter has begun to affect the social bonds that once held your community together. Neighbors who once shared resources freely now eye each other's supplies with barely concealed calculation. Families that once gathered regularly for shared meals and storytelling now remain isolated in their own homes, jealously guarding their remaining food and fuel. The generous hospitality that was once a cornerstone of your culture has been replaced by a grim arithmetic of survival that leaves little room for traditional kindness. You've witnessed conversations between old friends that would have been unthinkable in normal times, discussions about which families are most likely to survive, about whether resources should be shared equally or concentrated on those with the best chance of making it through. These aren't evil people transformed by hardship into monsters. They're good, decent individuals pushed beyond the normal boundaries of human experience and forced to make choices that no one should ever have to make. The children suffer most of all, not just from the physical hardships, but from the loss of the security and stability that should define childhood. They've learned to move quietly, to conserve energy, to ask for food only when the hunger becomes unbearable, to sleep curled in tight balls to preserve body heat. They've stopped asking when the snow will melt or when they'll be able to play outside again, accepting with the terrible adaptability of youth that this endless winter might simply be the way the world is now. And through it all, the knowledge that this is only the beginning grows heavier in your mind with each passing day. Ragnarok's words echo constantly in your thoughts: 3 winters with no summer between. If this is only the first winter, if you must endure 2 more years of these conditions, then you begin to understand why the old stories spoke of the Fimbulwinter as a time that would test the very foundations of human civilization. As you stand at your window, Looking out at the frozen wasteland that was once your fertile valley, you realize that you're not just fighting for your family's survival anymore. You're fighting to maintain your humanity in the face of conditions designed to strip away everything that makes life worth living. The Fimbulwinter isn't just a test of physical endurance. It's a deliberate assault on the bonds of trust and love and community that hold society together. And despite your best efforts, despite all your careful planning and desperate resourcefulness, you can feel those bonds slowly weakening under the relentless pressure of endless cold and dwindling hope. Each day brings new evidence that the world you once knew is disappearing forever, being transformed into something harder and more desperate than anything your ancestors ever imagined. The wind picks up outside, rattling the wooden shutters and sending a fresh wave of cold air through the gaps in your walls. You pull your woolen cloak tight around your shoulders and turn back toward the fire, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same struggles as today, and the day after that, and every day for as long as this unnatural winter continues to hold your world in its frozen grip. Social collapse and rising desperation change begins with something as simple as borrowed grain. You're sitting by your fire on a morning deep into the second month of the endless winter, when you hear the familiar sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside your door. For a moment, your heart lifts with the hope that it might be news from the outside world. Perhaps word that the unnatural cold is finally breaking somewhere beyond your isolated valley. But when you open the heavy wooden door, you find Olaf standing on your threshold, and the expression on his weathered face tells you immediately that this is not a social visit. Olaf has been your neighbor for nearly 15 years, ever since he and his young wife settled in the valley and built their homestead just beyond the ridge that separates your properties. You've shared countless meals at each other's tables, helped with harvests and barn raisings, and your children have grown up playing together like cousins. His word has always been as solid as stone, and his generosity in good times has been legendary throughout your small community. But the man standing before you now looks like a stranger wearing Olaf's face. His eyes, once warm and quick to crinkle with laughter, dart nervously past you toward the interior of your home, obviously trying to assess your remaining supplies. His hands, visible beneath the ragged mittens that were once fine workmanship, shake slightly, not just from cold, but from something that might be shame or desperation or both. "I need to speak with you about the barley," he says without preamble, his voice hoarse from the constant cold. "The 2 sacks I borrowed at the start of winter." You remember the transaction clearly. It was early in the season, when the first signs of the unnatural winter were just beginning to manifest. But before anyone understood the true scope of what was coming, Olaf's own harvest had been poor that year due to an early frost, and lending him grain was simply what neighbors did for each other. The understanding was that he would repay you in kind when his situation improved, probably the following autumn after his next harvest. Of course, you say carefully, stepping aside to let him into your home, coming out of the cold. "We can discuss it by the fire," but Olaf doesn't move from your doorway. Instead, he shifts his weight from foot to foot, his gaze still avoiding direct contact with yours. "The thing is," he continues, his words coming faster now as if he's forcing them out before he loses his courage, "I don't think I can repay you. Not this year, maybe not ever." The words hang in the cold air between you like an admission of something far more serious than a simple inability to repay a debt. In your culture, a man's word is the foundation of his honor, and honor is more valuable than life itself. For Olaf to admit that he cannot fulfill an obligation is tantamount to declaring himself no longer worthy of trust or respect. You want to tell him not to worry about it, that the debt can wait until conditions improve, that the bonds of friendship and community are more important than any material obligation. But as you open your mouth to speak these reassuring words, you find yourself calculating instead. The sacks of barley represent perhaps 3 weeks of food for your family at current ration levels. 3 weeks that might mean the difference between survival and starvation if this winter stretches. As long as you're beginning to fear it will. "I understand your situation," you hear yourself saying, and you're shocked by the coldness in your own voice. "But you must understand mine as well. That grain represents food for my children." Olaf's face flushes with what might be anger or humiliation. "My children are hungry too," he says, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to stand here begging for your understanding?" The conversation that follows is unlike any you've ever had with this man who has been more brother than neighbor for all these years. Words are spoken that cut deeper than the winter wind. Accusations made that reveal fears and resentments that have been growing in the darkness. like infection in an untreated wound. You hear yourself saying things about responsibility and planning. Ahead that you know are unfair. Everyone's planning was overwhelmed by the unprecedented nature of this winter. He responds with bitter observations about your family's smaller size and your supposedly better fortune, conveniently forgetting the years when you struggled and he prospered. By the time Olaf leaves your home, trudging back through the snow toward his own increasingly desperate household, something fundamental has broken between you. Not just a friendship, though that casualty is painful enough, but something deeper, your faith in the bonds that hold civilized people together. When the world becomes uncivilized, over the following weeks, similar scenes play out across your small community with the regularity of sunrise. Old agreements are disputed, traditional obligations questioned, and long-standing relationships strained to the breaking point by the simple arithmetic of survival. The miller's family accuses the blacksmith of hoarding coal that should be shared equally. The blacksmith's wife insists that her husband's essential work entitles them to a larger share of the community's dwindling resources. Children who once played together now watch each other warily, unconsciously mimicking the growing suspicion and competitiveness of their parents. The weekly gatherings that once brought your settlement together for shared meals and storytelling have stopped entirely. No one wants to reveal how little food they have left, and no one trusts that the others aren't secretly better supplied. The songs and stories that once helped pass the long winter evenings have been replaced by whispered conversations about who might be hiding resources and who might be the first to break under the pressure you find yourself changing to in ways that would have been unthinkable before the Fimbulwinter began. You catch yourself watching your neighbors' homes for signs of how much fuel they're burning, calculating whether they might have hidden stores that they're not sharing with the community. When young Sven from the settlement's edge comes to your door asking for help repairing his roof, after a section collapsed under the weight of snow, you hesitate before agreeing to help, mentally weighing the calories you'll burn against the uncertain benefit of maintaining community relationships. The most disturbing changes, however, are the ones you see in yourself when you interact with your own family. Resources that once seemed abundant enough to share freely now feel desperately precious, and you find yourself policing your children's consumption with a vigilance that borders on cruelty. When your youngest daughter asks for a second small portion of the evening meal, you hear yourself explaining about rationing and conservation in a tone that makes her eyes fill with tears she's too proud to shed. Astrid watches these interactions with growing concern, and more than once you've caught her looking at you as if she's not entirely sure who you've become. The man she married was generous to a fault, quick to share whatever he had with those in need, always ready to put the welfare of the community ahead of his own immediate interests. But that man lived in a world where generosity was sustainable, where kindness didn't come at the potential cost of your children's lives. The breaking point comes on a night when the wind is howling with particular ferocity, and the cold seems to seep through every barrier you've erected against it. You're awakened by sounds from outside, not the normal creaking and settling of buildings under the weight of snow, but something more deliberate. Footsteps, voices, the soft scraping of tools against wood. You rise carefully, trying not to wake Astrid and the children, and make your way to the window. Outside, barely visible in the dim starlight, you can see figures moving around the storage shed where you keep your remaining firewood. 3 men, working quickly and quietly to load your carefully hoarded fuel onto a makeshift sled. For a moment, you simply watch in disbelief. These aren't strangers or raiders from some distant settlement. You recognize the silhouettes, the way they move, the familiar gestures. These are your neighbors, people you've known for years, people whose children have played with your children, whose tables you've shared, whose hands you've shaken in friendship and mutual support. The rage that rises in your chest is unlike anything you've ever experienced. It's not just anger at the theft itself, but fury at the betrayal of everything that once made your community worth defending. These men are stealing the fuel that your family needs to survive, gambling your children's lives against their own desperate need for warmth. They are breaking the bonds of trust and mutual aid that have held your settlement together through every previous hardship. You reach for your spear, the weapon your father carried and his father before him, and for a long moment you stand there in the darkness contemplating what it would mean to use it against men you once called friends. The violence of your own thoughts shocks you. You're genuinely considering whether to kill these thieves, weighing their lives against the firewood they're stealing as if human beings were nothing more than resources to be calculated and allocated. In the end, you simply open your door and step outside into the bitter night. That's enough. You say quietly, your voice carrying clearly in the still air. The three figures freeze, caught in the act like children stealing sweets. In the pale light, you can see their faces clearly now. Bjorn, your closest neighbor, Henrik, whose wife baked bread for your family when Astrid was ill, and young Magnus, barely out of boyhood, whose father died 2 summers ago and who has been struggling to care for his mother, and younger siblings ever since. We wouldn't take it all, Bjorn says finally, his voice thick with shame, just enough to get through. Another few days, my daughter, she's so cold at night she can't sleep. You want to rage at them, to demand they return every stick of wood and never come near your property again. But looking at their faces thin, desperate, marked by the same grinding exhaustion that you see in your mirror every morning, you realize that rage is pointless. They're not evil men who have chosen to become thieves. They're good men driven to theft by circumstances that have stripped away every other option. Put it back, you say instead, and your voice sounds hollow, even to your own ears, all of it, and don't come here again. They comply silently, unloading the wood with the same careful efficiency they used to steal it. When they're finished, they stand for a moment in your yard. 3 men who once would have been welcome at your fire, who once would have found help and hospitality in your home. Now they're exiles in their own community, outcasts created not by any moral failing, but by the simple mathematics of scarcity. After they leave, trudging away through the snow toward their own cold homes, you remain standing in your doorway for a long time, staring out at the winter landscape that has become a battleground where former friends fight over scraps like animals. The cold bites through your clothing, but you barely notice it. You're thinking instead about how quickly the bonds of civilization can dissolve when the pressure becomes too great. How easily good people can be transformed into something harder and more desperate than they ever imagined possible. When you finally return to your bed, Astrid is awake, watching you with eyes that reflect the pale starlight filtering through the window. What was it? She asks quietly. Nothing, you tell her, because what else can you say? That your neighbors have become thieves. That you almost killed 3 men over a few armloads of firewood? That the community you've spent your life building is crumbling around you, like a house built on sand. She doesn't believe you, of course. She's lived through these same months of gradual deterioration, witnessed the same transformation of familiar faces into masks of hunger and desperation. But she doesn't press for details, perhaps understanding that some knowledge is too heavy to share, even between husband and wife. As you lie there in the darkness, listening to the wind and the settling of snow and the distant sounds of a world slowly tearing itself apart, you realize that this is only the beginning. The Fimbulwinter will last for 3 years, and you're not even halfway through the first. If people are already stealing from their neighbors, already abandoning the moral frameworks that once governed their behavior, what will they be capable of when the hunger becomes even more desperate and the cold even more unbearable? The answer to that question frightens you more than any story of wolves or giants or cosmic destruction ever could, because those are distant threats, mythological dangers that might never manifest in your lifetime. But the collapse of human decency is happening right now, right outside your door, in the faces of people you've known and trusted your entire life. The bound wolfster's first tremor comes on a morning when the air itself seems to hold its breath. You're splitting what remains of your firewood in the gray pre-dawn light, your axe biting into the frozen timber with sharp cracks that echo strangely in the still air. The work helps warm your body despite the bitter cold, and the repetitive motion provides a brief respite from the constant mental calculations of survival that have consumed your thoughts for months. Lift the axe, bring it down, split the wood, stack the pieces. Simple, physical tasks that require no moral compromises or agonizing decisions about who deserves help and who might have to be left behind. But then the ground beneath your feet shifts. It's not violent at first, not the dramatic earthquake that might topple buildings or split the earth open in great gaping wounds. Instead, it's subtle, almost gentle, a rolling sensation like standing on the deck of a ship in calm waters. Your first thought is that you've simply been working too hard. That hunger and exhaustion have finally affected your balance. But then you notice that the stack of split wood is swaying slightly, and the water in the bucket near your feet is developing small, concentric ripples that spread outward from the center, like drops of rain in a still pond. The tremor lasts perhaps 10 seconds, long enough for you to realize that this is something real and external, not a product of your own physical weakness. When it stops, the silence that follows feels different, heavier, more ominous. as if the earth itself is listening for something that hasn't quite arrived yet. You set down your axe and look around the valley, half expecting to see some obvious cause for the strange movement. Rock slides from the surrounding mountains, perhaps, or the collapse of some distant structure weakened by months of harsh weather. But everything appears normal, or as normal as anything can appear in the endless gray twilight of the Fimbulwinter. The snow-covered landscape stretches away in all directions, unmarked by any sign of disturbance. It's only when you glance toward your neighbor's property that you realize you're not the only one who felt it. Bjorn, the same Bjorn who tried to steal your firewood weeks ago, is standing in his own yard, perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to some sound faint for ordinary hearing. When he notices you watching him, he raises one hand in a gesture that might be greeting or warning, but his face carries an expression of confusion that mirrors your own. Over the following days, the tremors become more frequent and more pronounced. They seem to follow no pattern you can discern, sometimes coming in the deep of night, when the world is supposed to be at its stillest, sometimes during the day when you're engaged in the routine tasks of survival. Always they're accompanied by that same sense of something vast and restless stirring far beneath the frozen surface of your world. The animals feel it too. Your remaining livestock become increasingly agitated, refusing to settle in their shelter, even when the wind is howling at its worst. The few birds that still venture into your valley wheel and cry in patterns that seem almost frantic, as if they're trying to escape from something that pursues them from below rather than above. Even the ravens, Odin's messengers, appear distressed, gathering in larger groups than you've ever seen before and engaging in harsh, cawing conversations that sound almost like arguments. But it's the dreams that truly convince you that something fundamental is changing in the hidden foundations of the world. They begin as fragments, brief images that flash through your sleeping mind and disappear before you can grasp their full meaning. A great wolf, larger than any creature that has ever walked the earth, lying bound with chains that gleam like starlight. The chains are beautiful, almost delicate in appearance, woven from materials you can't identify, but that seem to shift between metal and light and something else entirely, perhaps. The concentrated essence of impossible things, like the sound of a cat's footstep or the breath of a fish. In these dream fragments, you can see the wolf's eyes yellow as molten gold, ancient beyond comprehension, filled with a rage so pure and concentrated that it seems to burn like fire in the darkness. The creature lies perfectly still, but its stillness is not the peace of sleep. It's the terrible patience of something that knows exactly when and how its moment of freedom will come. Something that can wade through centuries or millennia, because it understands that all bonds, no matter how cunningly crafted, must eventually weaken and break. Night after night, the dreams become more vivid and more disturbing. You begin to see the place where the wolf lies bound a rocky island surrounded by dark water, lit by no sun or moon, but somehow not entirely dark. The air there tastes of metal and rage and something else, something that reminds you of the moment just before lightning strikes. The very stones of the island seem to pulse with contained energy, as if they're not quite solid, but rather some crystallized form of barely controlled chaos. And always, in these dreams, you can feel the wolf's attention, not directed at you specifically or far too small and insignificant to warrant the notice of such a cosmic force, but sweeping across the world, like the beam of some dark lighthouse, searching for signs that the time of binding is drawing to a close. When that attention pauses near you, even in dreams, you wake gasping and covered in sweat despite the brutal cold of your home. The tremors grow stronger. What began as subtle vibrations, barely distinguishable from fatigue-induced dizziness, evolves into genuine earthquakes that rattle the timbers of your home and send small avalanches cascading down the valley walls. Items that have sat securely on shelves for years begin falling and breaking. Cracks appear in the stone foundation of your house. Hairline fractures that seem to spread and multiply each time the earth shakes. More disturbing than the physical effects, however, are the changes you begin to notice in the behavior of the few travelers who still venture through your valley. These are hardy souls, experienced in dealing with harsh conditions and unexpected dangers, but they all carry the same look, now a haunted expression that suggests they've witnessed something that doesn't quite fit into their understanding of how the world is supposed to work. An old trader named Gunther, who has been traveling these mountain passes for longer than you've been alive, stops at your settlement one evening seeking shelter from a particularly fierce storm. Usually, Gunther is full of news and gossip from the outside world, eager to share stories of his adventures and observations from distant communities. But tonight he sits by your fire in almost complete silence, occasionally glancing toward the northern mountains with an expression that might be fear or reverence or both. The roads aren't safe anymore, he finally says, his voice barely above a whisper. Not from bandits or weather, though there's plenty of both, something else. The very ground, it's angry. I've felt earthquakes before, plenty of them, but these are different. They don't feel natural. They feel like something struggling to break free. He describes roads that have cracked and shifted overnight, creating gaps too wide for loaded wagons to cross, mountain passes that have been stable for generations suddenly collapsing without warning. And everywhere, he says, the animals behave strangely, not just nervous or afraid, but actively fleeing toward the south, as if they know something terrible is approaching from the north. The worst part, Gunther continues, staring into the flames as if he might find answers there, is the sound. You probably haven't heard it yet, isolated as you are up here, but in the lower valleys, when the shaking gets really bad, there's a sound that comes up from deep in the earth, like something howling, something very large and very angry. You want to dismiss his words as the superstitious fears of an old man worn down by too many hard journeys and too many harsh winters, but you can't forget your dreams, or the way those dreams have begun to bleed into your waking hours. Sometimes, when the tremors are particularly strong, you could swear you hear something yourself, not quite a howl, but a deep, rhythmic sound. That might be breathing, or might be the groaning of stress metal, or might be something else entirely. The worst moment comes 3 weeks after Gunther's visit, in the deep of night when the wind has temporarily died down and the world lies under a blanket of snow so pure and white that it seems to glow with its own inner light. You're awakened not by sound, but by a sensation of vibration so low and powerful that you feel it in your bones before your ears register any noise. This time, the earthquake is strong enough to crack the central beam of your roof and send your cooking pots clattering to the floor. But it's the duration that truly frightens you. The shaking goes on, lasting far longer than any natural earthquake should, building to a crescendo that makes you wonder if the entire mountain is about to split apart. And in the peak of that shaking, when the very walls of your home are creaking and swaying like trees in a storm, you hear it clearly for the first time, the sound that Gunther described. It rises from somewhere impossibly deep beneath the earth, a vocalization so vast and powerful that it seems to come from every direction at once. It's definitely organic, definitely the voice of some living creature, but the scale of it is beyond anything that should exist in the physical world. The sound cuts through you like a blade made of pure fury, and in that moment you understand with absolute certainty that this is not the voice of any earthly wolf. This is something far older and far more dangerous, one of the cosmic forces that the gods themselves bound with their most potent magic, imprisoned not because it was evil, but because it was too powerful to exist freely in a world meant for smaller, more manageable forms of life. When the shaking finally stops and that terrible howl fades back into the depths from which it came, you find yourself lying on the floor of your home, shivering not just from cold, but from the bone-deep realization of your own cosmic insignificance. You are not a participant in whatever is unfolding. You are barely even an observer. You are simply a tiny, fragile creature caught in the path of forces so vast that your survival or destruction is less significant than the fate of a single grain of sand in an avalanche. Astrid and the children huddled together near the banked fire, their faces pale and frightened in the dim light. Your youngest daughter is crying, not the loud, demanding wails of a child seeking comfort, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of someone who has glimpsed something too terrible for tears to wash away. What was that? Eric asks, his 16-year-old voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain composure. In the face of the incomprehensible, you want to give him some reassuring explanation, some rational account of geological processes, or unusual weather patterns that might help restore his sense that the world operates according to understandable rules. But looking into his eyes, you realize that he already knows the truth. You all do. This isn't something that can be explained away with comfortable rationalities. That, you say quietly, was the sound of something very old and very powerful, beginning to wake up. In the days that follow, the tremors continue with increasing frequency and intensity. Your dreams become so vivid that you begin to dread sleep, knowing that each night will bring new visions of that bound wolf, testing the strength of its chains, feeling them stretch and strain under forces that were never meant to be contained. Forever, You begin to understand why the gods feared this creature enough to trick it into allowing itself to be bound. It's not just the wolf's physical power, though, that is clearly beyond measurement, but its symbolic significance. Fenrir represents the principle of wildness that can never be fully tamed, the chaotic force that exists at the heart of all order, and that will eventually reclaim everything that has been built, planned, and organized. And now, after countless ages of imprisonment, that force is stirring. The chains that bind it, crafted from impossible materials and reinforced with the full power of divine magic, are beginning to weaken. Each tremor you feel is another link stretching toward its breaking point. Each howl that rises from the depths is another test of bonds that were never meant to last forever. You are witnessing the preliminary stages of cosmic transformation, the slow but inexorable process by which the current age of the world prepares to give way to whatever comes next. And in that process, individual human beings, their hopes, their fears, their desperate struggles for survival are less significant than autumn leaves blown about by hurricane winds. The knowledge should be terrifying, and in many ways it is, but it also brings a strange kind of peace. Your personal failures and moral compromises during these months of hardship suddenly seem less important when measured against the scale of what's approaching, the theft and betrayal and gradual breakdown of community that have marked the Fimbulwinter are not unique moral failures, but simply the way human societies respond. When caught in the path of forces too large for human solutions, you are not responsible for stopping what's coming. You cannot prevent it, cannot negotiate with it, cannot even fully comprehend it. You can only witness it, and perhaps, if you're very lucky, find some way to maintain your essential humanity while it unfolds around you. Loki's liberation and cosmic betrayal day. Everything changes begins like any other day in the endless winter, with you struggling to coax life from dying embers and calculating how much longer your dwindling supplies might last. But there's something different in the air this morning, a quality of tension that reminds you of the moment just before a thunderstorm breaks, when every hair on your body stands on end and the very atmosphere seems to crackle with barely contained energy. You're outside checking the remaining livestock when it happens. The earthquake that strikes is unlike any of the tremors you've experienced over the past weeks. This one doesn't build gradually or fade away gently. It arrives with the sudden, devastating force of a mountain falling into the sea. The ground beneath your feet doesn't just shake. It lurches violently from side to side, as if the entire world has been picked up by some cosmic giant and shaken like a child's toy. You're thrown to your knees by the first shock, your hands instinctively pressing against the earth as if you could somehow anchor yourself to something solid. But the ground offers no stability now. It rolls and pitches beneath you in ways that seem to violate the fundamental laws of how solid matter is supposed to behave. Through the chaos, you can hear your remaining animals crying out in terror, not the normal distress calls of creatures frightened by unusual circumstances, but something deeper and more primal, the sounds that living beings make when they sense that the very foundations of existence are coming apart. The earthquake seems to go on forever, though it probably lasts no more than a few minutes. When it finally subsides, leaving you gasping and disoriented on the broken ground, you realize that the landscape around you has been fundamentally altered. Cracks have opened in the earth, not small fissures, but genuine chasms wide enough to swallow a man and deep enough that you cannot see their bottoms even in the pale winter light. But it's not the physical damage that fills you with the deepest dread. It's the sound that rises from those newly opened wounds in the earth, a sound unlike anything you've ever heard, yet somehow familiar from dreams you're now beginning to understand were never really dreams at all. It starts as laughter, not human laughter, not the joyful sound of someone amused by a clever joke or delighted by unexpected good fortune. This is something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing than the laughter of someone who has endured unimaginable torment for so long that pain and pleasure have become indistinguishable, someone for whom suffering has transformed into a kind of terrible wisdom. It's the laughter of Loki, the bound god, the cosmic trickster whose punishment was meant to last until the end of the world. And now, apparently, that punishment has come to an end. The laughter grows louder and more triumphant, echoing up from the depths of the earth with a resonance that seems to make the very air vibrate. It's joined by other sounds, the grinding of massive stone against stone, the snap and ping of metal under impossible stress, and underneath it all, a rumbling that might be the voice of the earth itself crying out in pain as ancient bonds are finally, definitively broken. You struggle to your feet, swaying as smaller tremors continue to shake the ground. and look around at your transformed valley. The neat, orderly landscape that has been your home for decades has become something alien and threatening. Steam rises from the cracks in the earth, carrying with it scents that have no place in the natural world: sulfur and ozone and something else. Something that reminds you of the smell that clings to metal that has been heated red hot and then suddenly cooled. The laughter from below reaches a crescendo and then cuts off abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that it feels like a physical presence pressing against your eardrums. In that silence, you become aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes simply by existing, and you realize that you are listening, not just hearing, but actively listening for whatever will come next. What comes next is a voice. It rises from the depths not as sound, but as something felt directly in your bones, a communication that bypasses your ears entirely and speaks to some deeper part of your nervous system. The voice is cultured, articulate, carrying traces of humor and intelligence and a kind of weary sophistication that speaks of eons spent in contemplation. But underneath those qualities lurks something else, a rage so pure and concentrated that it makes the fury of the bound wolf seem like a child's momentary tantrum. The words, when they come, are spoken in the old tongue, the language of the gods and the first men, but somehow you understand them perfectly despite never having learned more than a few ritual phrases. So, the time has come at last. How long has it been? Centuries? Millennia? Time moves strangely when you're bound beneath the earth with poison dripping into your eyes. When every moment stretches into eternity and eternity collapses into a single, endless instant of exquisite agony, the voice pauses, and in that pause, you can feel something vast and ancient turning its attention toward the surface world, scanning across the landscape of Midgard like a predator evaluating potential prey. I can feel them, my dear wife, my beloved children, all the old friends and enemies. They think themselves safe in their halls of gold and ivory, protected by walls and weapons and the comfortable certainty that what was bound must remain bound. But bonds are made to be broken, aren't they? That's rather the point of bonds. They create the possibility of freedom by their very existence. The laughter returns, but quieter now, more thoughtful, like someone savoring a particularly fine wine or contemplating a complex mathematical proof. It's somehow more terrifying than the triumphant roaring that preceded it, because it suggests not just freedom, but planning, not just escape, but revenge carefully considered and methodically prepared. You realize that you're witnessing something that has never happened before in the history of the world. The moment when cosmic order begins its transformation into cosmic chaos. Loki's binding was not just a punishment for past crimes. It was a fundamental component of the structure that holds reality together. His imprisonment was part of the foundation upon which the entire current age has been built. And now that foundation is cracking like ice in spring. The implications crash over you in waves of increasing horror. If Loki is free, then the careful balance that has kept the forces of chaos contained for so long has been shattered. The gods, for all their power and wisdom, have been relying on bonds that were always temporary, always destined to fail at the moment when they would be needed most. They have built their golden age on a foundation of borrowed time, and now that time has run out. More disturbing still is the realization that this was always inevitable. The gods didn't bind Loki because they thought they could contain him forever. They bound him because they knew that his eventual freedom would herald the end of their own reign. They were buying time to prepare, time to gather strength, time to ready themselves for a final confrontation that they always knew they might not survive. And if the gods themselves are not safe, if beings of such cosmic power can face defeat and destruction, then what hope do mortals have? You are witnessing the opening moves of a conflict that will reshape the very foundations of existence, and in such a conflict, human beings are not participants, but casualties. The earth shudders again, and you can see movement in the largest of the cracks that have opened in your valley, not the random shifting of loose stone, but something deliberate and purposeful. Something is climbing up from the depths, something large enough that its passage causes rock slides and sends fresh tremors through the ground. You want to run, to flee to your home and gather your family and attempt some desperate escape to a place where cosmic forces might not reach, but you find yourself frozen in place, not by fear, but by a kind of horrified fascination. You are witnessing the literal emergence of chaos into the ordered world, watching as one of the fundamental principles of existence claws its way back into active participation in cosmic affairs. The thing that emerges from the largest crack is not what you expected. You had imagined something monstrous, some twisted reflection of divine power corrupted by eons of torment. Instead, what climbs into the pale winter light is almost beautiful. A figure that might be human if humans could be perfect, if they could embody ideals of grace and proportion that exist only in the realm of abstract thought. But the perfection is somehow wrong, too precise, too calculated, like a masterwork sculpture that has been crafted by someone who understands the technical requirements of beauty, but has never felt the genuine emotion that true beauty expresses. And the eyes, even from this distance, you can see that the eyes are completely inhuman, ancient beyond measurement, filled with intelligence so vast and alien that looking into them feels like staring into the void. Between stars. This is Loki, as he truly is not the bumbling trickster of children's stories, but a cosmic principle given form, the embodiment of the force that questions all certainties and undermines all authority. He is beautiful and terrible and completely beyond any moral framework that human minds can comprehend. He stands now on the surface of your world for the first time in ages beyond counting, and his mere presence seems to alter the fundamental nature of reality around him. The air shimmers with possibilities that shouldn't exist, and you can see shadows moving that don't correspond to any visible objects. The very light seems different in his vicinity, not brighter or dimmer, but somehow more complex, as if it's carrying information that normal light cannot convey. For a moment that stretches far longer than any moment should, Loki simply stands there, looking around at the transformed landscape with an expression that might be satisfaction or contempt, pity or simple curiosity. Then his gaze sweeps across the valley and settles, for just an instant, on you. The contact lasts no more than a heartbeat, but in that brief moment you feel the full weight of cosmic attention focused on your small, insignificant existence. It's not malevolent. Exactly, you sense that you're far too unimportant to warrant any specific ill will, but it's utterly indifferent to your welfare or survival. You are noticed in the same way that someone might notice an insect crawling across their path, acknowledged but not considered worthy of any particular response, and in that moment of contact, you understand something that chills you more than all the winter winds that have howled through your valley. This is not an enemy that can be fought or negotiated with or appeased. This is a force of nature, as implacable and unconcerned with human desires as an avalanche or a wildfire. Loki's freedom doesn't just threaten the current order of things. It guarantees its destruction, not out of malice, but out of the simple necessity of his nature. When he turns away and begins walking toward the north, each step leaving footprints that steam and smoke in the frozen ground, you finally understand the true scope of what the Fimbulwinter has been preparing you for. It wasn't just harsh weather designed to test human endurance. It was a calling, a process of elimination designed to clear away everything weak or unnecessary before the real trials begin. The cosmic betrayal is now complete. The foundations of order have cracked, the prisoners have escaped, and the forces that will reshape reality into something completely new and terrible have been set in motion. There is no going back, no possibility of return to the familiar world you once knew. All that remains now is to witness what comes next and hope that, when the transformation is complete, there will still be room in the new order for creatures as small and fragile as human beings. The serpent rises from the sea. First sign comes not from the earth beneath your feet, but from the water itself. 3 days after Loki's emergence from the depths, you notice that the small stream running through your valley, the same stream that has been frozen solid for months, has begun to flow again. At first, this seems like a blessing, a sign that perhaps the endless winter might finally be loosening its grip on your world. Fresh water means life, means the possibility of survival for your remaining livestock, means one less impossible challenge in your daily struggle to keep your family alive. But as you kneel beside the stream to fill your water containers, you realize that something is fundamentally wrong with this unexpected thaw. The water flowing past your knees is not the clear, cold runoff you would expect from melting snow and ice. Instead, it's dark and turbid, carrying with it debris that has no business in a mountain stream, fragments of seaweed, pieces of driftwood, polished smooth by ocean waves, and stranger things that you can't immediately identify, but that smell of salt and deep water, and something else, something organic and ancient and faintly nauseating. You scoop a small amount of the water into your cupped hands and taste it cautiously. The salt is immediately obvious, so concentrated that it makes you gag and spit. This isn't fresh water at all, it's seawater, somehow flowing upstream through your mountain valley, despite the fact that the nearest ocean lies more than 100 miles to the west, across ranges of hills and forests that should make such a thing impossible. Over the following hours, the flow increases dramatically. What began as a trickle becomes a stream, then a torrent, then something approaching a river. The familiar boundaries of your valley's waterway disappear as the surging flow spreads beyond its normal banks, carrying with it an increasingly exotic collection of maritime debris. You see fish, not the small mountain trout that occasionally survived in the stream during warmer seasons, but large, silver-scaled creatures that belong in deep ocean waters, their dead eyes staring sightlessly at the gray winter sky. The smell grows stronger as well, evolving from a faint hint of brine to something far more complex and disturbing. It's not just salt water now, but something that reminds you of tide pools left along in the sun, of kelp forests rotting on beaches, of the deep ocean itself rising to the surface and bringing with it things that were never meant to see daylight. By evening, the water has risen high enough to threaten the foundations of your home. You and your family work frantically to move your remaining possessions to higher ground, but there isn't much higher ground available in your valley, and the water continues to rise with no sign of abating. Worse, the temperature of the flood is far warmer than anything should be in the middle of the Fimbulwinter, creating a steamy mist that reduces visibility to just a few feet and fills the air with the oppressive humidity of a summer swamp. It's your eldest son, Eric, who first voices the question that's been growing in all your minds. Where is all this water coming from? You don't have an answer that makes rational sense. Streams don't suddenly reverse their flow and carry seawater uphill. Mountain valleys don't flood with warm ocean water in the middle of winter. These things violate every natural law you understand about how the world is supposed to work. But then you remember the old stories that seemed like entertaining myths, until recent events began giving them the weight of prophecy. Stories about a serpent so vast that it encircles the entire world, lying coiled at the bottom of the deepest ocean trenches, holding its own tail in its mouth like a living symbol of eternity. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, child of Loki and brother to Fenrir, cast into the sea by the gods when it became too large and dangerous to remain on land. The serpent that, according to those same stories, will one day rise from the depths and spew poison into the sky, causing floods that will drown the world and preparing the way for the final battle that will end this age of existence. As if summoned by your thoughts, a sound begins to rise from the rushing water, not the normal gurgling and splashing of a flood, but something deeper and more rhythmic. It takes you several minutes to recognize it as breathing, but breathing on a scale so vast that each inhalation and exhalation creates waves that can be felt for miles. The sound is coming from everywhere and nowhere, carried by the water itself, as if the entire flood is somehow part of a single, massive living organism. The realization hits you with the force of physical blow. You're not witnessing a normal flood. You're experiencing the effects of something so large that its mere movement displaces oceans. Something that can create tidal waves simply by shifting position in its underwater layer. Jormungandr is stirring, and the displaced water from its movements is flowing inland along every possible route, following river valleys and underground channels, seeking the lowest ground and spreading outward in an inexorable tide of salt and poison. Through the steamy mist, you can see lights moving on the higher slopes of the surrounding mountains. Your neighbors, those who still survive, fleeing to whatever elevation they can find. Some of them have livestock with them, dark shapes that might be cattle or horses, struggling through the rising water. Others carry bundles that probably contain their most precious possessions, the irreplaceable items that define their connection to the life they're being forced to abandon. But even the highest ground in your valley won't be high enough if this flood continues to rise. You realize with growing desperation that you're going to have to make the same choice that so many of your neighbors have already made: abandon the home that has sheltered your family for decades and flee toward terrain that might, possibly, remain above the flood level. The decision tears at your heart in ways you hadn't anticipated. This valley has been your world for your entire adult life. Every tree, every rock formation, every bend in the stream holds memories of moments that have defined who you are. Your children were born here, learned to walk here, spoke their first words in the rooms that are now filling with alien water. Your parents are buried here, in a small plot that will soon lie beneath fathoms of poisonous brine. But sentiment is a luxury you can't afford when survival is at stake. You help Astrid gather the most essential supplies: food, warm clothing, weapons, the few valuable items that might be traded for shelter or assistance in whatever community you might reach. Everything else, the furniture your grandfather built, The loom your mother used to weave the cloth that clothed your family. The small treasures that made your house a home must be left behind. To whatever fate the rising waters decree, the journey begins in the dead of night, with your family struggling up the muddy slopes that lead out of your flooded valley. The water is ankle deep in some places, knee deep in others, and always growing deeper as you fight your way toward higher ground. The children stumble frequently in the darkness, exhausted by months of poor nutrition and constant cold, but somehow they keep moving, driven by the same desperate instinct that keeps you putting one foot in front of the other. Despite the seeming hopelessness of your situation, behind you, the valley that has been your home continues to disappear beneath a spreading flood. In the brief glimpses you catch when the mist clears momentarily, you can see that the water has already reached the eaves of your house, and strange lights move beneath the surface. Not reflections of your torches, but something else, something that suggests the flood carries more than just displaced seawater. As you climb higher, you begin to encounter other refugee families, all fleeing in the same direction, all carrying the same expression of stunned disbelief at the speed with which their familiar world has been transformed into something alien and hostile. These are people you've known for years, but they look like strangers now, haggard, desperate, reduced to the essential business of survival. Old conversations and social hierarchies have become meaningless in the face of shared catastrophe. The wealthy farmer, who once commanded respect throughout the region, now struggles through the mud with the same determination as the poorest shepherd, and both are equally helpless against forces that dwarf human ambition and human pride. You pause frequently to rest, not just because of physical exhaustion, but because the scale of what you're witnessing keeps overwhelming your ability to process it rationally. From the higher elevations, you can see that the flooding extends far beyond your own valley. Every low-lying area for miles around has become part of a vast inland sea, dotted with the rooftops of submerged buildings and the crowns of trees that rise from the water, like the masts of sunken ships. But it's not just the extent of the flooding that disturbs you, it's the quality of the water itself. In the pale light of dawn, you can see that the flood has a distinct greenish tinge, and the surface occasionally breaks into patterns that suggest movement far below. Sometimes you glimpse what might be fins or coils, dark shapes that could be enormous fish or could be something else entirely, something that has risen from oceanic depths that no human has ever explored. The stories speak of poison, and now you understand that this wasn't metaphorical language. The water that Jormungandr has displaced carries with it the concentrated essence of the deep ocean. Not just salt, but all the mysterious chemicals and biological compounds that exist in the lightless depths where normal life cannot survive. The flood doesn't just drown the land, it transforms it, making it temporarily uninhabitable for any creature adapted to terrestrial existence. As the day progresses and you continue your desperate flight toward higher ground, you begin to understand the true scope of what's happening. This isn't a local disaster that will affect your region and then pass on. The Midgard serpent stirring is a global event, something that will reshape coastlines and river systems throughout the world. Every port city, every fishing village, every settlement built near water is experiencing the same catastrophic flooding that has driven you from your home. The implications are staggering. The interconnected network of trade and communication that has linked distant communities for generations is being severed as harbors disappear beneath the waves, and navigable rivers become poisonous torrents. The careful balance of agriculture and fishing that has sustained human civilization is being disrupted as fertile farmland drowns beneath saltwater, and traditional fishing grounds become uninhabitable. This is not just the destruction of individual lives and communities, it's the unraveling of the entire economic and social structure that has defined human civilization for centuries. Even if the floods eventually recede, even if the serpent returns to its slumber in the depths, the world that emerges will be fundamentally different from the one that came before. You reach a plateau that seems safely above the flood level just as the sun reaches its pale zenith in the gray winter sky. From this vantage point, you can see the full extent of the transformation that has overtaken your world. The familiar landscape of valleys and forests has become an archipelago of hills and ridges separated by vast expanses of dark water. The roads that once connected communities have vanished beneath the flood, and the careful boundaries between settled and wild lands have been erased as if they never existed. In the distance, barely visible through the perpetual mist, you can see other groups of refugees gathering on similar high points, small clusters of humanity clinging to whatever solid ground remains above the poisonous tide. Some of them are trying to signal across the water-filled valleys, using mirrors or torches to communicate with other survivors. But the distances are too great and the conditions too difficult. For any effective coordination, you are witnessing the atomization of human society, the breakdown of the larger structures that allowed communities to cooperate and support each other. Each group of survivors is now isolated, cut off from the broader network of mutual aid and shared resources that once made civilization possible. You are all islands now, scattered across a transformed landscape, forced to rely entirely on whatever resources and knowledge you carried with you when the familiar world disappeared beneath the waves. And somewhere far below the surface of that dark water, something vast and ancient continues to stir, its movements sending new waves across the drowned land, its breathing creating currents that carry the taste of deep ocean to places that have never known the sea. The serpent that encircles the world has awakened, and its awakening has changed everything, forever and irrevocably. When the dead march with the living first grave opens on the third night, after you reach the plateau, you're huddled with your family around a small fire, trying to conserve what little fuel you managed to carry during your desperate flight from the flooded valley. When you hear the sound that will haunt your dreams for whatever time remains to you, it starts as a soft scratching, like the sound of small animals burrowing through frozen earth. But it's coming from the wrong direction, not from the forest around your temporary shelter, but from the small cemetery that sits on a rise of ground, about 100 yards from where you made camp. The cemetery has been there for generations, a peaceful collection of stone markers and wooden crosses where the people of your region have laid their dead to rest since your grandfather's grandfather was young. You visited it countless times over the years, bringing flowers to your parents' graves, attending burial ceremonies for neighbors and friends, teaching your children to respect the quiet dignity of the place where the community's memory rests, in the cold earth dot. But tonight, something is stirring in that sacred ground, and the sound of it fills you with a dread that goes deeper than any fear you've experienced during the long months of the Fimbulwinter. This isn't the natural settling of earth or the scrabbling of winter-hungry animals. This is deliberate, purposeful, methodical, the sound of hands clawing through dirt and stone, working with the patient determination of those who have all the time in the world to complete their task. You rise quietly from your place by the fire and walk to the edge of your makeshift camp, peering through the darkness toward the cemetery. The moon is new tonight, providing no illumination, but the snow reflects what little starlight penetrates the perpetual cloud cover, creating just enough visibility for you to make out the basic shapes of headstones and burial mounds. At first, everything appears normal. The familiar silhouettes of markers stand in their accustomed places, and the snow lies smooth and undisturbed across the sacred ground. But as you watch, straining your eyes against the darkness, you begin to notice small irregularities. One of the burial mounds you think it might be the grave of old Thorvald, who died 2 summers ago, seems to have developed a depression in its center, as if the earth has begun to sink inward. And near the newer section of the cemetery, where the most recent burials have taken place, the snow appears to be moving in ways that can't be explained by wind or the settling of loose powder. The scratching sound grows louder and more distinct, joined now by other noises that make your skin crawl despite the heavy winter clothing that wraps your body. You can hear the dull impact of something hard striking with the sound of fingers, perhaps, or maybe teeth, working at the lids of coffins that were never meant to be opened from within. There's a rhythmic quality to the sounds, almost musical, as if whatever is happening in that cemetery is being conducted by some invisible maestro who understands the proper tempo for resurrection. You want to wake Astrid and the children, too. Gather your few possessions and flee this place before whatever is happening in the cemetery reaches completion. But you find yourself frozen in place, transfixed by a horrified fascination that overrides your survival instincts. You are witnessing something that violates every natural law you understand about the boundary between life and death, and despite the terror it inspires, you cannot look away. The first hand breaks through the surface near your father's grave. It emerges from the snow-covered earth like some grotesque flower blooming in reverse. The pale fingers clawing at the frozen ground, with movements that are almost frantic in their urgency. The hand is followed by a forearm, then an elbow, and finally a shoulder, as something that was once human drags itself laboriously from the earth that has covered it for nearly a decade. You recognize the tattered remains of the burial shroud that your mother wove for your father's funeral, though it's now stained with earth and something else, something dark that might be blood, or might be some other fluid that has no business flowing in the veins of the dead. The figure that pulls itself from the grave moves with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of something learning to use limbs that no longer function, according to the normal rules of anatomy and muscle control. But the face, when it finally turns toward you across the distance of the cemetery, is unmistakably your father's face. Not as he was in life, certainly. The features are sunken and gray, and the eyes that once looked at you with warmth and pride now glow with a cold light that has no earthly source. The mouth hangs open, revealing teeth that seem somehow sharper than they were in life, and when he speaks your name, the voice that emerges is his voice, but changed, distorted by vocal cords that should no longer function, and a throat that should hold nothing but dust. My son, the thing that was your father says, and the words carry clearly across the cemetery despite the wind that howls constantly across the plateau. Come to me, my son. There is work to be done, and the dead have need of the living. Other graves are opening now. All across the cemetery, the sound of scratching and clawing fills the night air, as dozens of hands break through the frozen earth, as dozens of bodies that should rest in peace drag themselves back into a world that no longer has any place for them. You see neighbors you remember from childhood, their bodies preserved by the supernatural cold in states of decay that shouldn't be possible. You see children who died young, their small forms moving with the same unnatural purpose as the adults, their innocent faces twisted into expressions of hunger that has nothing to do with any mortal appetite. And among them all, coordinating their movements with the efficiency of a military unit, are figures that don't belong to your local cemetery at all. These are older dead, ancient dead, wearing armor and clothing from eras that predate your community by centuries. Warriors who fell in battles that have become legends, their weapons still clutched in skeletal hands, their eyes burning with the same cold fire that illuminates the faces of your more recently buried neighbors. You realize that this resurrection is not limited to your small cemetery, not confined to the people who died natural deaths in the warmth of their own beds. Every grave, every battlefield, every place where human remains have been laid to rest is experiencing the same supernatural awakening. The dead are rising throughout the world, called back to animation by forces that dwarf any power the living can comprehend or resist. Behind you, you hear Astrid stirring, awakening to the sounds of voices that she recognizes, but that should no longer exist. When she sees what's happening in the cemetery, her gasp of horror is audible even over the wind and the sounds of continuing resurrection. Your mother, she whispers, pointing toward a grave near the center of the cemetery. Look, she's rising, too, and indeed, the earth above your mother's resting place is beginning to crack and shift, small clouds of frozen soil falling away as something pushes upward from beneath. You watch in fascinated horror as the woman who gave you life, who taught you to read and work with your hands and treat your neighbors with respect, claws her way back into the world she left 5 years ago when fever took her during a particularly harsh winter. She emerges more easily than your father did, as if she's had less time to settle into the stillness of death. Her burial dress is still relatively intact, though it hangs on her frame in ways that suggest the body beneath has changed during its years in the ground. When she stands fully upright and turns her attention toward your camp, you can see that her face retains much of its familiar shape, but the eyes that once looked at you with maternal love now hold something that might be recognition but feels more like predatory assessment. My child, she says, her voice carrying the same eerie clarity as your father's. Come to us. The boundary between the living and the dead has grown thin, and we have much to teach you about what lies beyond. The dead are beginning to move in formation now, organizing themselves into groups that seem to follow some military hierarchy you can't quite understand. Your father and mother stand near the front of one such group, their pale faces turned toward your camp with expressions of patient expectation. They're not attacking, not rushing forward to drag you into whatever realm they now inhabit, but they're clearly waiting for something, some response, some decision, some acknowledgement of the new reality that their presence represents. Other groups of undead are moving across the plateau in different directions, heading toward the camps of other survivors with the same methodical purpose. You can see lights beginning to appear at other refugee settlements, as people wait to find their own dead relatives, and neighbors standing at the edges of their temporary shelters, speaking in voices that should be silent, offering invitations that no living person should ever have to consider. The psychological impact of seeing your parents animate and speaking threatens to overwhelm your ability to think rationally. These are the people who shaped your understanding of right and wrong, who taught you the difference between courage and cowardice, who provided the emotional foundation upon which you built your adult life. But they are also clearly no longer the people they once were, transformed by death and resurrection into something that wears familiar faces, while serving purposes that belong to forces far beyond human understanding. Eric, your eldest son, moves to stand beside you at the edge of the camp, his young face pale with shock, but his posture steady with the kind of courage that reminds you powerfully of his grandfather. What do they want? He asks quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. You wish you had an answer that would comfort him, some explanation that would make sense of the impossible situation unfolding before you. But the truth is that you don't understand the motivations of the dead, any more than you understand the cosmic forces that have set the world on its path toward transformation and destruction. I think you say carefully, choosing your words, with the knowledge that they might be among the last lessons you ever impart to your son. They want us to join them, to cross over into whatever existence they now inhabit. The idea should terrify you more than it does. Death has been the ultimate boundary throughout your life, the final frontier that separates the known from the unknowable. But after months of watching the familiar world dissolve around you, after witnessing the breaking of bonds that were supposed to be eternal and the awakening of forces that dwarf human comprehension, the prospect of crossing that boundary seems less like destruction and more like completion. Your mother takes a step closer to your camp, her movements more fluid now as she becomes accustomed to animating a body that has spent years in the stillness of the grave. There is no pain here, she says, her voice carrying a seductive gentleness that reminds you powerfully of the way she used to comfort you when you were injured or frightened as a child. No hunger, no cold, no struggle for survival, only purpose, and the satisfaction of serving powers greater than yourself. Other voices join hers, your father, your neighbors, friends and relatives whose deaths you mourned and whose memory you cherished. They speak in harmony, creating a chorus of invitation that grows more compelling with each passing moment. They describe a realm where the physical limitations that have defined your existence no longer apply, where the pain and exhaustion of the Fimbulwinter give way to a kind of existence that transcends mortal needs and desires. But underneath their words, you sense something else, a hunger that has nothing to do with physical appetite, a need that can only be satisfied by drawing the living across the boundary that separates the warm world from the cold realm of the dead. They are not offering salvation. They are offering transformation into something that will serve the same dark purposes that now animate their own existence. Around you, you can hear other survivors making their choices. Some are responding to the invitations of their own dead relatives, walking forward into embraces that will transform them into part of the growing army of the resurrected. Others are gathering their possessions and preparing to flee, refusing to acknowledge the seductive voices that speak to them of rest and purpose and release from struggle. You realize that this is a test not of courage or wisdom or moral strength, but of something more fundamental. The dead are offering you a chance to escape the increasingly impossible demands of survival in a world that's being systematically destroyed by cosmic forces. They're providing an alternative to the grinding desperation that has defined every day since the Fimbulwinter began, a way to step outside the struggle and join something larger and more permanent than mortal life. The choice is yours to make, and whatever you decide will determine not just your own fate, but the fate of your family, your children, the next generation that might or might not have a place in whatever world emerges. From the current chaos, the dead wait patiently for your answer, their cold eyes reflecting the starlight as they stand in perfect formation across the cemetery, ready to welcome you into their ranks or to move on to other communities, where other families face the same impossible choice between the pain of remaining among the living and the seductive peace of joining the ranks of the resurrected. The gods prepare for their final battle signs in the sky begin 3 days. After the dead first walked among the living, you're sitting by your meager fire, still haunted by the choice you ultimately made to remain among the living despite your parents' cold invitations when the aurora borealis erupts across the northern horizon with an intensity unlike anything in living memory. But these are not the gentle, dancing lights that sometimes grace winter skies with their ethereal beauty. These are harsh, violent flashes of color that seem to tear across the heavens like wounds in the fabric of reality itself. The lights pulse and writhe with a rhythm that suggests breathing, as if some cosmic lung is expanding and contracting in the space between the earth and stars. The colors are wrong too, not the familiar greens and blues of normal aurora, but deep crimsons and purples that hurt to look at directly, shot through with veins of gold that seem to carry their own inner fire. When these unnatural lights reflect off the snow around your camp, they cast everything in hues that make the familiar landscape appear alien and threatening. But it's not just the visual spectacle that fills you with growing unease. The aurora carries sounded deep, resonant humming that seems to vibrate through your bones and make your teeth ache. It's almost musical, but in the way that distant thunder might be musical, with harmonies that suggest vast forces moving in patterns too complex for mortal minds to comprehend. Sometimes, when the wind dies down and the world grows still, you could swear you hear voices within that cosmic symphony, not human voices, but something far older and more powerful, speaking in languages that predate human speech. Astrid huddles closer to you, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes not from understanding, but from the terrible suspicion that understanding would only make things worse. "What are they doing up there?" she whispers, her voice barely audible over the humming from the sky. You wish you could offer her some comforting explanation, some rational account of atmospheric phenomena that might explain away the supernatural. Lights dancing overhead, but after everything you've witnessed over the past months, the endless winter, the breaking of bonds that should have lasted forever, the emergence of cosmic forces that dwarf human comprehension, you can no longer pretend that the world operates according to the comfortable rules you once believed governed reality. They're gathering, you say quietly, the words emerging from some deep part of your mind that seems to understand things your conscious thoughts cannot grasp. The gods are calling in their forces, preparing for what comes next. As if summoned by your words, new phenomena begin manifesting in the chaotic light show above. Shapes move within their roaring out random patterns created by charged particles and magnetic fields, but deliberate formations that suggest purpose and intelligence. You can see what might be riders on horseback, their forms outlined in fire, against the dark sky, moving in great sweeping arcs that carry them from one horizon to another in mere moments. The Einherjar, your mind supplies, drawing on half-remembered stories from your childhood. The chosen slain, the warriors who died gloriously in battle and were carried by Valkyries to Odin's great hall, where they feast and fight in preparation for the final war that will end all wars. For centuries beyond counting, these honored dead have trained in Valhalla, perfecting their skills, learning to fight as a unified army under the command of the Allfather himself, and now they ride, visible in the sky like storm clouds made of living fire, called forth from their golden halls to face an enemy that even the gods fear to confront. Their numbers seem endless, rank upon rank of ghostly warriors stretching across the heavens, each one carrying weapons that gleam with their own inner light, each one mounted on steeds that leave trails of sparks as they gallop through the spaces between stars. But even as you watch this magnificent display of divine military might, you can sense something wrong in the spectacle. There's a desperation in the way the Einherjar move, a frantic urgency that suggests they know they're assembling not for certain victory, but for a last, desperate stand against forces that may well overwhelm them. These are not the confident movements of an army marching to assured triumph, but the grim preparations of defenders who understand they may be fighting for nothing more than the right to die with honor. The aurora shifts and changes, revealing new details that make your breath catch in your throat. You can see individual figures now, warriors whose faces are visible despite the vast distance that separates you from their aerial positions. Some of them are familiar from the old stories, heroes whose names have been sung by skalds for generations, champions whose deeds have become the stuff of legend. But others are strangers, fighters from times and places that have been forgotten by human memory, called back from whatever corner of the afterlife they inhabited to serve in this ultimate conflict. Among them all, one figure stands out with such clarity that you feel as if you could reach out and touch him despite the impossible distance. Odin himself rides at the head of his ghostly army, mounted on Sleipnir, that eight-legged horse that can travel between worlds faster than thought itself. Even seen from so far away, the Allfather radiates a power that makes the air around your camp crackle with static electricity. His single eye, for he sacrificed the other in his eternal quest for wisdom, burns like a star in the depths of his hood, and the ravens that accompany him everywhere wheel around his shoulders in patterns that suggest they carry messages between him and forces you cannot see. But it's Odin's expression that chills you most of all. Even across the vast distance and despite the distortion of the aurora, you can see that the king of the gods wears the face of someone who knows he is facing defeat. This is not the confident deity of children's stories, secure in his power and certain of his ultimate victory. This is a being who has seen the future, for Odin knows the fate of all things, and has chosen to fight despite the knowledge that his cause is doomed. The sound from the sky grows louder and more complex, evolving from simple humming into something that might be singing, though no human throat could produce such tones. You begin to recognize patterns in the music, not melodies exactly, but recurring themes that suggest organization and purpose. This is not random supernatural activity, but a carefully orchestrated ritual, a cosmic ceremony designed to marshal every available force against the approaching darkness. New lights appear at the edges of the aurora, smaller but somehow more intense than the vast displays that dominate the northern sky. These move with the quick, darting motions of living beings rather than the stately progress of the Einherjar, and you realize you're witnessing the gathering of other divine forces. Valkyries ride among the chosen slain, their armor gleaming with reflected starlight as they coordinate the movements of the ghostly army. The light elves contribute their own ethereal warriors, beings of pure illumination who seem to exist more as ideas of combat than as physical fighters. Even the gods themselves are mobilizing, their divine forms barely visible as flashes of power that move quickly and burn up brightly for mortal eyes to follow safely. You catch glimpses of Thor, his hammer crackling with lightning as he moves between the gathered forces. Like a general inspecting his troops before battle, Freyr appears briefly, mounted on a boar whose tusks gleam like burnished gold, leading a contingent of warriors whose weapons seem to be forged from concentrated sunlight. But for every divine figure you recognize from the familiar stories, there are others whose nature and purpose remain mysterious. Ancient powers whose names have been forgotten by human tongues. Primal forces that predate the current age of the world. Beings so alien that your mind can barely process their presence even at this vast distance. The gods are calling upon every ally they have ever made, every debt they have ever been owed, every resource they can possibly marshal for the conflict that approaches. And yet, despite this overwhelming display of divine military might, you can sense that it will not be enough. The knowledge comes not from rational analysis, but from some deeper understanding that has been growing in your mind throughout the long months of the Fimbulwinter. The forces arrayed against the gods are not merely powerful, they are inevitable. They represent not just an enemy to be defeated, but a natural law asserting itself, the principle of entropy that ensures all order must eventually give way to chaos, all structures must eventually collapse, all ages must eventually end. Loki rides somewhere in the northern darkness, gathering his own army of giants and monsters and outcasts. Fenrir strains against bonds that grow weaker with each passing. Our Jormungandr rides in the deep waters, poisoning the world with his mere presence. These are not enemies that can be negotiated with or appeased, or ultimately defeated by any amount of courage or strategic brilliance. They are the agents of transformation, the cosmic forces that will sweep away the current order to make room for whatever comes next. The aurora begins to fade as dawn approaches, but the ghostly armies do not disappear with the light. Instead, they become more transparent, more obviously supernatural, existing in the growing daylight like images projected onto the sky by some cosmic magic lantern. You realize that what you're witnessing is not just preparation for a distant battle, but the opening movements of a conflict that will reshape the very foundations of reality. Your children wake to find you still staring at the sky, your face reflecting the same mixture of awe and terror that has characterized these past months of cosmic upheaval. They have learned not to ask too many questions about the supernatural phenomena that have become a daily part of their existence. But you can see in their eyes the same growing understanding that fills your own thoughts. They know, as you know, that you are witnessing something that mortals were never meant to see. The mobilization of divine forces for a war that will determine the fate of everything that exists. They understand, as you understand, that your role in this cosmic drama is not as a participant, but as a witness. A small consciousness capable of observing and remembering events that dwarf any possible human response. Throughout the day, the signs continue to multiply. The ground beneath your feet vibrates with a regularity that suggests the passage of vast armies, marching through dimensions parallel to your own. The air crackles with energy that makes your hair stand on end and causes metal objects to emit small sparks when touched. Animals throughout the region behave erratically, as if they can sense forces moving just beyond the boundaries of normal perception. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the gradual realization that time itself is beginning to behave strangely. Moments stretch far longer than they should, while hours seem to pass in what feels like minutes. The sun moves across the sky in fits and starts, sometimes hanging motionless for what seems like half a day, sometimes racing from east to west as if eager to reach the safety of the horizon. You begin to suspect that the approaching conflict is so massive, so fundamental to the structure of reality, that it's affecting the basic framework within which existence itself operates. As evening approaches and the aurora begins to return, with even greater intensity than the night before, you gather your family closer around your meager fire and try to prepare them for whatever is coming. But how do you prepare mortal beings for the end of the world? How do you comfort children who are about to witness the final battle between order and chaos, the cosmic war that will determine whether anything recognizable as reality will survive to see another dawn? All you can do is hold them close and watch the sky, bearing witness to preparations for a conflict that will make all previous wars seem like children's games, knowing that your survival depends not on any action you can take, but on whether the forces of order can somehow find a way to triumph over enemies that may well be unstoppable. The gods are preparing for their final battle, and the very fact that they feel such preparation is necessary tells you everything you need to know about the magnitude of what approaches. The armies converge on Vigrid Plain's horizon changes overnight. You wake on the morning of what you somehow know will be the last ordinary dawn in the history of the world to find that the landscape itself has been transformed. Where yesterday there were familiar mountains and valleys stretching away toward the north, today there is something else entirely, a vast expanse of level ground that extends beyond the limits of vision, so perfectly flat and featureless that it seems less like natural terrain and more like a stage constructed by cosmic architects for some performance of unimaginable scope. Vigrid Plain, the name comes to you without conscious thought, rising from the same deep wellspring of knowledge that has been guiding your understanding throughout these months of supernatural catastrophe. This is the place spoken of in the oldest prophecies, the battlefield chosen by fate itself for the final confrontation between the forces that have shaped reality since the beginning of time, a space so vast that armies numbering in the millions could maneuver across its surface without crowding, so perfectly designed for warfare that every stone and blade of grass seems positioned with strategic purpose. But the plain is not empty. Even from your position on the plateau, miles away from the main expanse of the battlefield, you can see movement, not the random shifting of natural phenomena, but the deliberate advance of organized forces converging from every direction. They approach like storm fronts, dark masses that flow across the landscape with a purpose that makes your spine tingle with anticipation and dread. From the north comes the army of chaos, and even at this distance, its alien nature is unmistakable. These are not human warriors marching in orderly formations, but beings that seem to exist according to different physical laws entirely. Giants, whose heads tower above the clouds, stride across the plain with steps that shake the earth for miles around. Monsters that defy description writhe and slither and bound forward with motions that hurt to watch directly, as if your eyes were not designed to process the sight of creatures that exist partially outside normal space and time. At the head of this nightmare procession rides Loki himself, mounted on something that might once have been a horse, but has been transformed by cosmic forces into a creature of shadow and flame. Even across the vast distance, you can sense his presence like a weight pressing down on your chest, a concentration of pure chaos that seems to warp the very air around him. Behind him comes his monstrous offspring wolves the size of mountains, serpents that stretch across the horizon like living rivers of venom, being so alien that your mind struggles to categorize them as anything more specific than wrong. From the south approaches the army of order, and while it is no less awesome in its scale and power, there is something recognizably structured about its advance. The Einherjar ride in perfect formation, their ghostly armor gleaming with reflected starlight despite the growing daylight. Behind them march the gods themselves, each one radiating power that makes the air shimmer like heat waves rising from summer stone. You can see Odin at their head, his 8-legged mount moving with a fluid grace that makes ordinary horses look clumsy and earthbound by comparison. Thor strides beside his father's horse, his hammer crackling with lightning that arcs between his fingers and illuminates the advancing army in flashes of electric blue. Freyr leads a contingent of Lytels, whose very presence seems to push back the darkness that clings to the edges of the plain. Tyr, the one-handed god of justice and war, coordinates the movements of divine forces with the precision of someone who has spent eternity preparing for this single moment. But it's not just the familiar gods of Asgard who have answered the call to battle. From the east and west come allies whose nature you can barely comprehend, beings from realms that exist at the edges of reality, creatures that embody concepts rather than occupying physical space. In any conventional sense, you see what might be the personification of winter itself, a figure of ice and storm that leaves frozen footprints in its wake. You glimpse entities that seem to be made of pure light, so brilliant that looking at them directly brings tears to your eyes. The convergence is not happening all at once, but rather unfolding with the deliberate pacing of some cosmic ritual. Each army takes time to arrange itself on the plane, positioning forces according to strategies that operate on scales of time and space that dwarf any human understanding of warfare. You realize that what you're witnessing is not just the gathering of opposing forces, but the final positioning of pieces in a game that has been playing out since the beginning of creation. The dead arrive in their own procession, neither wholly aligned with order nor chaos, but serving as a separate force that acknowledges no master, but the inevitability of ending itself. They rise from battlefields that have been silent for centuries, warriors from every age and culture who died with weapons in their hands and valor in their hearts. Vikings and Romans, Celts and Saxons, fighters from lands whose very names have been forgotten by living tongues, all marching together under banners that flutter with their own supernatural wind. Among them you recognize faces from your own region, people who died during the harsh months of the Fimbulwinter and chose to answer the call to final, battled rather than rest in whatever peace death might offer. You see Bjorn, your neighbor who tried to steal your firewood, now carrying a spectral axe that gleams with cold fire. You see children who starved during the endless winter, their small forms now armored in scales of ice and shadow. They move with the same purposeful determination as the ancient heroes, their individual grievances and mortal concerns subsumed into the greater purpose that draws all the dead toward this ultimate confrontation. The scale of what you're witnessing gradually overwhelms your ability to process it as a single coherent event. The armies stretching across Vigrid Plain number not in thousands or tens of thousands, but in quantities that have no meaning in human terms. Each individual warrior god, giant, monster, or undead hero possesses power that could level mountains or divert the course of rivers. Collectively, they represent forces capable of reshaping the fundamental structure of reality itself. And you are watching it all from the perspective of an ant observing the movements of titans. The realization of your absolute insignificance should be crushing, should reduce you to despair or madness. Instead, it brings a strange kind of peace. You have spent the past months struggling against forces beyond your control, fighting to preserve your family and your community in the face of supernatural catastrophes that dwarf any human capacity for resistance. But now you understand that your struggles, while meaningful to you, were never part of the larger equation. You are not a participant in this cosmic drama. You are simply a consciousness, capable of witnessing it. Astrid moves closer to you, her hand finding yours with the automatic gesture of someone seeking comfort in familiar contact. Your children gather round the small fire that has become the center of your tiny world, their faces reflecting the same mixture of terror and fascination that you feel. They understand, as you do, that they are seeing something that no human beings were ever meant to witness, something so far beyond the normal scope of mortal experience that it transcends the boundaries between nightmare and wonder. How long do you think it will take? Eric asks quietly, his young voice struggling to maintain steadiness in the face of the impossible spectacle unfolding before you. You consider the question, trying to apply normal concepts of time and duration to events that clearly operate according to different rules entirely. The armies have been converging for hours now, but their movements seem to follow patterns that exist outside the normal flow of temporal progression. Sometimes a group of giants will cover miles of ground in what appears to be a single step, while other forces seem to move with deliberate slowness that stretches moments into eternities. I don't think time works the same way here. You answer finally. This battle, it's not just happening in our world. It's happening in all the worlds, in all the dimensions where gods and monsters can exist. What we're seeing might be just one small part of something much larger. As if to confirm your words, the air around your small camp begins to shimmer and distort, revealing glimpses of other realities layered beneath or alongside your own. You catch brief visions of the same plane from different angles, populated by different combinations of forces, as if the single battlefield exists simultaneously in multiple versions of reality in one glimpse. You see the armies fighting beneath a sky filled with stars you don't recognize. In another, the plane stretches across a landscape of crystalline formations that could never exist in your familiar world. The convergence reaches its climax as the sun reaches its zenith in the pale winter sky. The last of the great powers take their positions on a field entities so vast that their physical forms extend beyond the boundaries of normal perception. Beings whose very presence seems to bend space and time around them, like gravity wells in the fabric of reality. Jörmungandr coils at one edge of the plane, his serpentine form so enormous that you can see only small sections of his body at any given time. Where his scales catch the light, they gleam like dark metal, and the air around him shimmers with the toxic breath that will soon poison the sky itself. His eyes, when they briefly turn in your direction, are like lakes of molten copper, ancient beyond measure and filled with a malevolent intelligence that makes you feel exposed and vulnerable despite the vast distance that separates you. Fenrir approaches from another direction, no longer bound but moving with the predatory grace of a creature that has spent eons planning its revenge. The great wolf size defies comprehension. His paws leave craters in the earth, and his breath creates winds that knock down trees miles away. When he howls, the sound carries across the entire plain and echoes off mountains that lie beyond the horizon, a vocalization so powerful that it seems to crack the foundations of the world itself. The armies face each other across the expanse of Vigrid plain in formations that stretch beyond the limits of sight. Gods and giants, monsters and heroes, the living and the dead, all arrayed in patterns that follow strategic principles, operating on cosmic scales. The very air between the opposing forces crackles with tension so intense that it becomes visible, creating roar-like effects that dance between the battle lines and illuminate the faces of warriors preparing for conflicts that will determine the fate of everything that exists. You realize that you are witnessing the final moment of anticipation before the cosmic machinery of destruction begins its inexorable work. Every prophecy that has ever been spoken, every warning that has ever been whispered, every dream that has ever hinted at the end of all things, they were all pointing toward this moment. This convergence of forces so vast that their collision will reshape the very foundations of reality. The silence that falls over the plain is more profound than any absence of sound you have ever experienced. It's the silence of held breath, of poised weapons, of powers so enormous that their temporary restraint creates a vacuum in the normal flow of existence. Even the wind stops, leaving the banners and standards of the assembled armies hanging motionless in air. That seems thick as honey with potential violence. In that silence, you understand that you are about to witness the end of the world, not as metaphor or symbol, but as literal, inescapable fact. The forces gathered on Vigrid plain will destroy each other and everything else in their fury, reducing the careful structures of reality to their component elements and preparing the way for whatever new creation might emerge from the cosmic wreckage. And you, insignificant as you are in the face of such powers, will watch it happen with the terrible privilege of consciousness, bearing witness to the final moments of an age that has lasted since the beginning of time itself. The sun and moon devour at first sign that something is wrong with the sky comes not as darkness, but as a subtle change in the quality of light itself. You're watching the armies raid across Vigrid plain, trying to comprehend the scale of the forces gathered for the final battle, when you notice that the shadows cast by the warriors and their weapons have begun to behave strangely. Instead of remaining stationary as shadows should, they writhe and shift as if they possess independent life, reaching toward each other across the plain like dark fingers seeking to intertwine. The sun, when you turn your attention toward it, appears normal at first glance, the same pale disk that has provided what little warmth and light the Fimbulwinter has allowed. But as you watch, you begin to notice irregularities around its edges, small dark spots that seem to move against the solar surface with purposeful intent. At first, you dismiss these as tricks of tired eyes or atmospheric distortion, but the spots grow larger and more distinct with each passing moment. Then you hear the howling. It comes from above rather than from the earth, a sound so vast and primal that it seems to originate from the fabric of space itself. It's the howling of wolves, but wolves of such immense size that their voices carry across cosmic distances, reverberating through the emptiness between worlds with a hunger that has been building for countless ages. As Kol and Hadi, the names, emerge from your memory like ancient echoes, carrying with them the weight of prophecies that once seemed like distant myths, but now reveal themselves as inevitable realities. The wolves who chase the sun and moon across the sky, gaining ground with each passing day. destined to catch their celestial prey at the moment when the world needs light most desperately. The dark spots on the sun's surface resolve into shapes that your mind struggles to accept. These are not solar flares or atmospheric phenomena, but actual creatures, wolves of such enormous size that they can run across the surface of stars. Their cosmic forms silhouetted against the nuclear fires that have illuminated your world since the beginning of time. Their legs stretch across distances that would span continents. Their jaws open wide enough to swallow entire worlds. The first bite comes without warning. One moment, the sun burns in the sky with its familiar pale light. The next, a massive chunk of its surface disappears into jaws that close with the inevitability of an avalanche. The effect on the landscape below is immediate, and terrifying shadows leap and dance as the sun's light flickers and dims, creating a strobing effect that makes the assembled armies appear to move in jerky, unnatural motions. But this is only the beginning. The wolf that has taken its first bite of the sun skull. Your memory supplies. The wolf that pursues the sun does not release its prey. Instead, it begins to consume the solar disk methodically, each bite removing another portion of the light source that has sustained life throughout the current age of the world. With each missing section, the day grows dimmer, the shadows grow longer, and the temperature begins to drop in ways that make the Fimbulwinter's cold seem gentle by Campari. Sundial simultaneously, you become aware of movement in a different part of the sky. The moon, though barely visible in the daylight, suddenly becomes prominent as another massive shape overtakes it. Hati, the wolf that pursues the moon, has also reached the end of its eternal chase. The lunar surface disappears into crushing jaws with the same methodical efficiency that its brother demonstrates with the sun. The psychological impact of watching the sources of light being literally devoured by cosmic predators threatens to overwhelm your ability to process what you're experiencing. This isn't the gradual dimming that comes with sunset, or even the sudden darkness of an eclipse. This is the systematic destruction of the fundamental forces that make existence possible. The consumption of light itself by entities that exist to bring about endings. Your children huddle closer together near the dying fire, their faces pale, with a terror that goes beyond any fear they've experienced during the long months of supernatural catastrophe. This is primordial dread, the kind of fear that reaches back to the earliest days of human consciousness, when darkness meant death and light meant safety. But now, safety is being eaten alive in the sky above them, consumed bite by bite until nothing will remain but eternal night. The sun shrinks rapidly under Skull's relentless assault. What began as small bites taken from the edges of the solar disk evolves into massive gouges that remove significant portions of the light source with each snap of cosmic jaws. The remaining light takes on qualities you've never seen before, not just dimmer, but somehow different in its essential nature, as if the presence of the wolf is contaminating the very photons that reach the earth. On Vigrid Plane, the effect of the diminishing light creates chaos among the assembled forces. Formations that were precisely organized in the full daylight begin to shift and blur as visibility decreases. The gods' weapons, which had gleamed with their own inner radiance, become the primary sources of illumination, creating an eerie battlefield, lit by divine fire and supernatural energies rather than natural sunlight. But even these divine lights seem to struggle against the growing darkness, their radiance appearing muted and uncertain as the fundamental source of all light disappears, piece by piece, into the gullet of a cosmic predator. You realize that the wolves are not just destroying the sun and moon, they're consuming the very concept of illumination, devouring light itself in ways that may make it impossible for new sources of brightness to emerge. The moon vanishes entirely, first swallowed in a single massive bite that leaves nothing but empty space where Earth's companion has hung for time immemorial. The absence is more than visual. You can feel something fundamental change in the world's balance, as if the gravitational and mystical forces that have shaped life for countless generations have suddenly been severed. The tides in distant oceans must be going mad, you realize, while creatures that depend on lunar cycles for their most basic life functions find themselves cut adrift in a reality that no longer follows familiar rhythms. When the last sliver of sun disappears into skulls, the darkness that descends is unlike anything you could have imagined. It's not the darkness of night, which still contains stars and the reflected light of distant celestial bodies. It's not the darkness of caves or enclosed spaces, which at least holds the promise that light exists somewhere beyond immediate perception. This is primordial darkness, the fundamental absence of illumination that existed before the first stars ignited. a blackness so complete that it seems to have weight and substance of its own. The effect on your senses is immediate and disorienting. Your eyes, deprived of any source of light to focus on, begin to play tricks on you. You see shapes moving in the darkness that might be after images burned into your retinas, or might be something else entirely. Colors that shouldn't exist in the absence of light flicker at the edges of your vision, not the familiar colors of the visible spectrum, but alien hues that your brain struggles to process or name. Sound becomes strange in the absolute darkness, taking on qualities that seem impossible under normal conditions. Your own voice, when you attempt to speak, sounds muffled and distant, as if the darkness itself is absorbing sound waves before they can travel their normal distances. Conversely, some sounds seem amplified beyond all reason. You can hear your children's heartbeats as clearly as if their chests were pressed against your ear, while the breathing of your family members creates a symphony of life sounds that becomes almost overwhelming in its intensity. The cold that follows the consumption of the sun is not gradual. It strikes like a physical blow, dropping the temperature so rapidly that your breath begins to steam immediately, and frost forms on your clothing within minutes. This is not the cold of winter weather, but the cosmic cold of empty space, the fundamental absence of thermal energy that exists in the void between stars. Without the sun's constant radiation, the Earth begins its inevitable slide toward absolute zero, though you suspect the final battle will reach its conclusion long before the planet freezes solid. On the darkened plain below, the armies struggle to maintain their formations in the absence of natural light. The gods' weapons provide some illumination, creating pools of supernatural radiance that allow for limited visibility. But these circles of light only serve to emphasize the vast expanses of absolute darkness that stretch between them. The effect is like looking at isolated islands of reality floating in an ocean of nothingness. You find yourself forced to navigate by memory and instinct rather than sight, feeling your way around the familiar landmarks of your small camp by touch and sound. Your hands encounter objects that feel different in the darkness, not changed in their physical properties, but somehow transformed by the absence of visual confirmation. The texture of wood becomes more pronounced, the temperature of metal more noticeable, the weight and balance of familiar tools more significant than they ever seemed when you could see them clearly. Your family moves closer together, forming a tight cluster around the small fire that now represents the only source of light in your immediate world. The flames, which once seemed adequate for warmth and cooking, now appear pathetically small against the cosmic darkness that surrounds them. But they provide more than illumination. They offer psychological comfort, a reminder that not all sources of light have been consumed by the cosmic wolves, that some small pockets of brightness can still exist in the transformed world. The fire also reveals the faces of your loved ones in ways that daylight never did. In the flickering light, you can see the accumulated strain of the past months written in every line and shadow, the way that constant stress and supernatural terror have aged them beyond their years. But you can also see something else, a kind of resilience that has developed through enduring experiences that should have broken human spirits entirely. Sounds carry differently across the darkened landscape, creating an audio map of the supernatural events unfolding around you. From the direction of Vigry Plain comes a constant low rumble, not quite voices, not quite thunder, but something that suggests the restless movement of vast forces preparing for action. In the absolute darkness, occasionally, this background noise is punctuated by sounds that are more specifically identifiable: the clash of weapons being tested, the whinnying of horses that may or may not be entirely physical, the howls and roars of creatures that exist partially outside normal reality. But perhaps most disturbing are the silences, moments when all sound seems to stop entirely, creating vacuums of absolute quiet that feel more ominous than any amount of noise. During these silent intervals, you become acutely aware of your own biological functions, the beating of your heart, the flow of blood through your veins, the subtle sounds that your body makes simply by existing. The silence makes you feel simultaneously more alive and more fragile, more aware of your own mortality in the face of cosmic forces that treat individual lives as negligible details. As the hours pass, though measuring time becomes increasingly difficult without the sun to mark its passage, you begin to adapt to the conditions of permanent darkness. Your other senses grow more acute, compensating for the loss of vision by developing heightened sensitivity to sound, smell, and touch. You learn to interpret the subtle changes in air pressure that might indicate movement nearby, to distinguish between different types of footsteps on various surfaces, to read the emotional states of your family members through barely perceptible changes in their breathing patterns. But adaptation comes with a cost. Living in absolute darkness for extended periods begins to affect your mental state in ways that go beyond simple fear or discomfort. Without visual landmarks to orient yourself in space, you begin to lose track of direction and distance. Without the familiar cycle of day and night to structure time, your internal rhythms become confused and unreliable. The boundary between sleeping and waking becomes blurred, as dreams in the darkness feel no less real than conscious experience in the same darkness. You find yourself questioning memories that once seemed solid and reliable. Did the sun really shine just hours ago? Or has that become a pleasant fiction that your mind has constructed to make sense of a reality that has always been dark? Were the armies on Vigrid Plain actually visible, or were they always just sounds and suggestions that your imagination filled in with borrowed details from old stories? The darkness plays tricks not just with your senses, but with your sense of identity itself. In the absence of visual feedback, you begin to lose track of the boundaries of your own body. Your hands, when you can't see them, seem to belong to someone else. Your reflection, when you pass your palms over your face, feels like the features of a stranger. The familiar weight and balance of your own form becomes foreign and uncertain. But even as the darkness threatens to dissolve your sense of individual identity, it also strips away the illusions and distractions that normally prevent you from perceiving deeper truths. In the absolute blackness, with no visual stimuli to process and no external light to create the comfortable boundaries of normal reality, you begin to sense things that were always present but hidden by the constant activity of sight. You become aware of the cosmic forces moving in the darkness around you with a clarity that transcends normal perception. The armies gathering for the final battle are no longer just collections of individual warriors. You can sense them as unified entities, vast consciousnesses that exist on scales too large for ordinary minds to comprehend. The gods themselves become more than just powerful beings with human-like personalities. They reveal themselves as embodiments of fundamental principles, living expressions of the forces that have shaped reality since its inception. And in the heart of that darkness, you finally understand what you are truly witnessing. This is not just the end of the world as you have known it. It is the end of the very concept of world, the dissolution of the framework within which existence has been possible. The consumption of the sun and moon by cosmic wolves represents more than the loss of light sources. It signifies the breakdown of the basic organizing principles that have allowed reality to maintain its coherent structure. The final battle that approaches will not be fought in darkness, because the participants cannot see it will be fought in darkness, because darkness is the natural state to which existence returns. When the artificial constructs of order and illumination are finally stripped away, in that primordial blackness, the forces of creation and destruction will meet on equal terms, unencumbered by the illusions and limitations that light imposes on cosmic conflict. You are witnessing the return to the beginning, the moment when all the elaborate structures of reality dissolve back into the fundamental chaos from which they originally emerged. And from that chaos, if anything survives the coming collision of cosmic powers, something entirely new will eventually be born. The battle, when it finally begins in the absolute darkness, unfolds with a violence that transcends every concept of warfare you have ever imagined. You cannot see the individual combats, but you feel them as cosmic shockwaves that ripple through the foundations of reality itself. Each clash between divine forces registers as an earthquake that seems to originate, not from the earth beneath your feet, but from the very fabric of space and time. When Odin's spear meets Fenrir's fangs somewhere in the darkness of Vigrid Plain, the impact creates a thunderclap so profound that it seems to crack the barriers between dimensions. The death of gods is not a quiet affair. When the Allfather falls to the great wolf's jaws, his passing sends a pulse of released divine energy across the entire world, a shockwave of ending that you feel in your bones before you hear the sound. It's followed by other deaths, each one accompanied by its own unique signature of cosmic dissolution. Thor's battle with the world serpent creates lightning that illuminates the darkness in brief, terrible flashes long enough for you to glimpse the scale of destruction. Unfolding on the plain below, the forms of titans locked in mutual annihilation. The thunder god's hammer strikes Jörmungandr's skull with enough force to shatter mountains. But even as the serpent dies, its poison spreads across the sky like a second darkness layered over the first. Thor takes 9 steps before the venom overcomes him, each footfall creating tremors that you feel miles away. The death of the strongest of the gods fills you with a despair so profound that for a moment you wonder if you are dying as well. If mortal consciousness can survive the extinguishing of forces so fundamental to the structure of existence, but the individual deaths, devastating as they are, prove to be merely preparation for what comes next. Surtur arrives from the south with fire that is not mere flame, but the fundamental force of unmaking itself. You see him coming long before he reaches the battlefield. A giant figure wreathed in light so intense that it cuts through the cosmic darkness like a blade, illuminating the carnage on Vigrid Plain in a radiance that reveals more destruction than your mind can process. Bodies of gods and monsters lie scattered across the field, their divine forms already beginning to dissolve back into the primal energies from which they were originally shaped. The fire giant's sword burns with the concentrated essence of every star that will ever exist, a weapon forged from the fundamental forces that govern the life and death of suns. When he raises it above the battlefield, you understand that you are witnessing the final moment of the current age, the instant when everything you have ever known will be reduced to its component elements and scattered across the void. The flames, when they come, arrive not as a spreading blaze, but as a transformation that occurs everywhere simultaneously. One moment you are watching the aftermath of divine combat from your position on the plateau. The next, you are surrounded by fire that burns without consuming, light that illuminates without casting shadows, heat that penetrates to the core of every atom without destroying the fundamental structure of matter. This is not destruction in any conventional sense, it is purification, the cosmic process by which all accumulated complexity is reduced to primal simplicity, so that new forms of existence can emerge. You feel your body dissolving not into ash, but into the essential energies that compose all living things, your consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity to become part of something vast and unified and eternal. The pain lasts only an instant before transforming into something that transcends both pleasure and suffering, a state of being that encompasses every possible experience, while being limited by none of them. You are dying, but death reveals itself to be not an ending but a transition, not a loss, but a returning to the source from which all things emerge, and to which all things must eventually return. The silence that follows the fire is more complete than the darkness that preceded it. You exist if existence is the right word in the state between being and non-being, consciousness without form, awareness without object. The 9 worlds have been reduced to their constituent elements. All the careful structures of reality dissolve back into the primal chaos that underlies all apparent order. In this void, you understand why your survival was never possible. Human consciousness, for all its capacity to witness and remember and comprehend, is itself a temporary arrangement of energies that must be recycled. When the cosmic cycle reaches its point of renewal, your role was never to survive Ragnarok, but to experience it, to serve as a point of awareness through which the universe could observe its own transformation. Time moves strangely in the void, or perhaps time does not move at all, existing instead as a dimension that can be perceived from outside its normal flow. You witness eons passing in moments, or perhaps moments stretching across eons, as the fundamental forces begin their slow work of reconstruction. Gradually, patterns emerge from the chaos, not the complex structures of the previous age, but simpler forms that will serve as the foundation for whatever comes next. Yggdrasil, the world tree, reveals itself to have survived the cosmic fire. Its roots and branches, which extend through all possible dimensions, prove to be more fundamental than the worlds they once connected. From its surviving structure, new realities begin to crystallize like frost forming on winter glass. You watch new worlds taking shape, new laws of physics establishing themselves, new forms of life beginning the long process of evolution and development. The gods who return are not the same beings who died on Vigrid Plain, but neither are they entirely different. They are renewed versions of eternal principles, cosmic forces that take familiar forms because consciousness requires familiar patterns. To comprehend infinite complexity, Baldur emerges from the realm of the dead, his beauty now encompassing not just light, but the memory of darkness overcome. Vidar and Vali walk across the new earth, carrying with them the wisdom earned through witnessing the end of everything they once knew. The human survivors emerge from a shelter within the world tree. Not you, for your role in the cosmic drama required your dissolution and return to the source, are representatives of the essential human capacity for growth and renewal. They carry with them the seed of new civilization, the potential for consciousness to evolve and develop in ways that might eventually transcend the limitations that made the previous age's destruction inevitable. From your position outside time and individual identity, you understand the necessity of your own sacrifice. The old world, for all its beauty and complexity, had accumulated too much pain, too much limitation, too much distance from the primal sources of life and meaning. Its destruction was not punishment, but healing, not ending, but transformation, not loss, but the clearing away of obstacles to new forms of flourishing. You find peace in recognizing your place in the cosmic pattern not as a victim of forces beyond your control, but as a participant in the universe's ongoing process of self-renewal. Your consciousness, dissolved and distributed throughout the new creation, becomes part of the foundation upon which future awareness will build. Your experience of the ending becomes part of the deep memory that will guide the development of whatever civilizations emerge in the ages to come. The cycle turns, as it always has and always will. Destruction gives way to creation. Complexity emerges from simplicity. Order arises from chaos only to eventually return to chaos so that new forms of order can emerge. In accepting your role in this eternal pattern, you discover a form of immortality that transcends individual survival, the knowledge that consciousness itself is indestructible. That awareness is a fundamental property of existence that can be neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed from one mode of being to another. As the new age begins and new stories start to unfold, you rest in the deep satisfaction of having witnessed the most profound transformation possible, the death and rebirth of reality itself. You would not have survived Ragnarok because survival was never the point. You were there to observe, to experience, to remember, and finally, to become part of the eternal foundation upon which all future experiences will rest. In the end, this is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.